The stone that held the light of vanished stars in the beginning. There was darkness. Not the darkness we know from closing curtains or extinguishing candles, but the older darkness, the kind that existed before anyone thought to capture light and hold it. Before flame. Before the first human hand reached toward the sun and wondered if such radiance could be kept, carried, preserved against the night. It is said that in chambers beneath temples whose names have been worn smooth by time, there exists a substance that should not be. A mineral, a gift, a mystery wrapped in stone. The ancients called it many things. Frozen moonlight, star breath, the tears of mountains. But what they called it matters less than what it did, and what it did defies every law we have written to explain the world. When held to flame, it would glow, not like metal that grows hot and bright and dangerous, but with a light that needed nothing, consumed nothing, demanded nothing. A light that would last for days, for weeks, gentle and constant as a held breath. And when the glow finally faded, if it faded, the stone remained unchanged. Cool to the touch, patient, ready to be awakened again. Whispers tell us it came from mountains that no longer appear on any map. Peaks that have either crumbled into dust or exist now only in the geography of memory, in the old songs that cartographers no longer trust. The people who first discovered it left no written records, no cities we can excavate, no pottery shards to carbon date and catalog. They left only this: fragments of illuminated stone, scattered across continents, buried with the sacred dead, hidden in the walls of ruins that predate the civilizations we thought were first. Modern laboratories have held these fragments under microscopes and spectrometers, have subjected them to every test that science allows. The reports read like poetry written by confused machines. The molecular structure defies categories. It sits between states of matter like a held breath, neither quite solid nor entirely present in the dimension we understand as physical space. Elements that should not bond are bonded. Patterns that suggest mathematics we have not yet discovered repeat themselves at every scale, from the atomic to the visible, as if the stone contains within itself the blueprint of some larger order we cannot perceive. But let us travel backward, before the laboratories, before the questions. Let us return to darkness, to the moment before illumination. Imagine the first artificers, the forgotten hands that learned the stone's secret. Perhaps it was accident, a piece of strange rock thrown into a fire during some ceremony, some desperate attempt to commune with gods who seemed so distant. And then, as the flames died down and the night pressed close again, the glow beginning, soft, impossible, sacred. What did they feel, those first witnesses? Did they understand they had found something that would outlast every empire they might build? Did they know that 3,000 years later, their discovery would still be glowing behind museum glass, still withholding its deepest truth? We follow the thread through civilizations that rose and fell by this light. In monasteries carved into cliffside stone, where wind was the only visitor and silence the only doctrine, monks read sacred texts by its glow. They believe some records suggest that the light brought them closer to divine understanding, that words read by this radiance carried different meanings, revealed layers hidden from those who studied by torch or sun. Manuscripts survive from these communities, margins filled with notes that speak of revelations received during deep study, insights that came not from the texts themselves, but from the quality of light that fell upon them. The monks are gone now. The monasteries remain, empty chambers where the wind still moves through corridors like memory through a dreaming mind. But the stones they used, some of them have been recovered, and they still glow faintly, as if waiting for the next hand to hold them, the next eyes to read by their impossible light. Beneath the silence of certain landscapes, archaeologists have discovered cities that never saw the sun. Not crypts or tombs, but living spaces, entire populations that chose to dwell in the earth, to build their homes, and raise their children under stone ceilings, in caverns lit by this gentle radiance. The architecture suggests permanence, suggests generations. Kitchens and gathering halls, workshops where artisans carved and wove, chambers where the old were tended and the young were taught the stories that held their world together. Why they lived below, we can only imagine. Perhaps the surface had become too dangerous, too scarred by wars that no history recorded. Perhaps they were hiding from something, or seeking something found only in depths. Or perhaps they simply preferred this light steady and cool and kind to the burning eye of day. In royal chambers, in palaces whose stones now lie scattered like broken teeth across desert floors, the luminous mineral was said to possess another property. It revealed truth in the faces of liars. Ambassadors and accused criminals were brought before thrones illuminated by its glow, and kings watched for signs, for shadows that moved wrong, for the subtle tells that this light somehow made visible. Whether this was true or merely a belief that made guilty parties confess before the light could expose them, we cannot know. But the stories persist, carved in languages we are still learning to read, painted on walls that have survived everything except certainty. The mystery deepens when we ask, where did it go? The last known deposit, according to fragments of texts pieced together from a dozen sources, was exhausted in an age before written memory. The mountains gave up their final harvest, and then there was no more. No new veins discovered, no hidden caches waiting to be found, only the fragments already gathered, already distributed among temples and treasuries, already glowing in their patient way. Alchemists spent lifetimes trying to recreate what ancient hands had known instinctively. Libraries preserved their journals' pages dense with diagrams and formulas, experiments repeated 1,000 times with 1,000 variations. They tried every combination of minerals they could find, subjected them to every heat and pressure, whispered prayers over them, and left them beneath full moons and buried them in sacred earth. Some claimed to have succeeded. Briefly, a glow that lasted hours instead of days, a light that flickered and died. But none could match what the ancients had done without trying, what they had simply known how to harvest and use. Perhaps the knowledge was deliberately lost. Perhaps it was considered too sacred to write down, meant to pass only from teacher to student, from hand to hand, until the chain broke and the understanding faded like breath on cold air. Or perhaps the knowledge required a kind of seeing that we have educated ourselves away from, a sensitivity to the world that modern minds no longer possess. Today, in museums scattered across continents, fragments rest behind glass. Protective atmospheres surround them, nitrogen, sometimes, or carefully controlled darkness between the hours when visitors might observe. Curators monitor them with instruments, documenting the slow, imperceptible dimming that takes place over decades, over centuries. But still they glow. 3,000 years old, some of them, held in tombs with the honored dead, buried with priests and kings, and those whose names meant something once. And still, when the lights in the museum dim, when the last visitor has left and the halls settle into their nighttime hush, the fragments emit their faint luminescence. Not bright enough to read by, not anymore, but present, constant, defiant of entropy and explanation. Scientists return to them periodically, hoping new instruments might reveal what older ones could not. The papers they publish are careful, hedged with qualifications, filled with phrases like anomalous properties and further study required. They cannot say what it is. They can only describe what it does and wonder. Some nights, when sleep pulls at the edges of thought, it is enough to imagine that light, to picture those fragments glowing softly in their cases, surrounded by darkness, neither asking for nor needing our understanding. A light that requires no fuel, no heat, no sacrifice. A light that simply is, because once, in mountains that may no longer exist, something in the stone learned to hold the memory of stars. And perhaps that is the deepest mystery, not how it works, but that it exists at all. That in a universe governed by decay and the slow unwinding of all things, something persists, something holds, something continues to shine gently, impossibly, in the darkness that surrounds us all. We close where we began, in darkness, but now we carry with us the knowledge that darkness is not the only truth. That somewhere, in sealed chambers and forgotten halls, in museums and ruins and places we have not yet found, light endures without reason, without explanation, only the quiet wonder of existence itself, still glowing after everything else has faded, still holding something we cannot name but recognize nonetheless, still waiting, patient as stone, for the next witness to arrive. The map that led into shadow. There are maps that guide us toward destinations, and then there are maps that guide us toward ourselves. In the archives of a coastal library, where stone walls have stood against salt air and the patient hunger of time for 700 years, there rests a document that should not exist. A chart, a testament, a question drawn on vellum and sealed with wax that bears symbols older than any alphabet we recognize. It lies in a climate-controlled chamber now, behind glass that filters the light to a whisper, protected from the very air that might, over centuries, unmake it. But protection cannot contain what it suggests, cannot seal away the implications drawn in ink that has not faded, on material that refuses to age according to the rules that govern all other things. The vellum itself is the first mystery, tested and retested, analyzed by laboratories in 3 countries. The verdict remains the same. It comes from an animal no taxonomist can identify. Not cow, not sheep, not any creature documented in the fossil record or walking the earth today. The hide is too fine, too uniform, processed with techniques that leave no trace of the tools that must have shaped it. As if the animal offered its skin willingly, as if the transformation from living flesh to writing surface required no violence, no craft, only intention. Upon this impossible canvas, someone drew the world. But not our world. Not quite. The lines trace continents that match no coastline ever recorded. Land masses that resemble what we know the way a reflection resembles the thing reflected, close enough to recognize, different enough to disturb. Here is something like Africa, but the rivers run wrong. There is an echo of Asia, but the mountains arrange themselves in patterns that geology says should not hold. Coastlines curve where our oceans are straight, and straight where our shores bend into bays and harbors. Yet scattered across this altered earth, rendered with extraordinary precision, are cities. Cities that would not be founded for another 500 years after the map was drawn. The cartographer signed no name, left no journal, no letters, no record of their existence beyond this single artifact. They simply drew, and when the work was finished, rolled the vellum tight and sealed it with wax. The seal remains unbroken, broken and resealed perhaps by the one who first discovered it, but the wax itself contains pollen from plants that have not flowered in recorded history, and the symbols pressed into its surface predate written language itself. Spirals within spirals, marks that might be stars or seeds or eyes, watching across centuries. It is said that the map was discovered by accident, as the most profound things often are. A young archivist, cataloging documents in preparation for their digitization, noticed a tube made of leather and sealed at both ends. The catalog listed it simply as "Scroll, Origin Unknown, 14th Century," but when she carefully broke the seal and unrolled the contents, when she saw the cities marked with names that should not have been known for generations, when she traced the coastlines that matched nothing in her atlas, she understood she was holding something that violated the timeline of human knowledge. The theories began immediately, as theories do when confronted with impossibility. Time traveler, said some. Someone who journeyed backward from our age, carrying knowledge of cities yet to be built, attempting to record or perhaps to warn. But the cities shown are not quite accurate, close, but slightly wrong, as if remembered from a distance or drawn from descriptions rather than direct observation. Prophet, said others. A visionary granted sight beyond their time, shown the shape of what would come and tasked with recording it. Religious scholars examined the symbols in the wax, found patterns that echo sacred geometries from traditions separated by oceans and centuries, as if the map existed at an intersection of all spiritual understanding. Madman with coincidental genius, suggested the skeptics. Pure chance that some of the markings happened to align with cities that would later arise. Pareidolia on a continental scale. We see what we expect to see, find meaning in randomness, because the alternative is too unsettling. But the true mystery, the one that deepens the longer you study the map, emerges not from what is drawn but from what is left blank. Vast regions, carefully outlined and then left empty. Not the emptiness of oceans or deserts, which are marked with their own symbols and notations, but a different kind of void. These territories bear only a single word, repeated in a language that scholars have identified as predating Sumerian, belonging to no known civilization. The translation is uncertain, disputed, but consensus suggests something close to where the old Earth remembers, where memory lives in the land itself, where geography becomes something other than fixed coordinates and measurable distances. Whispers tell us that explorers have tried to match these empty territories with actual geography. They have studied the map's coordinates, such as they are, and ventured to the places it suggests. Some claim to have found them islands that appear on no satellite, valleys that cannot be photographed, coastlines that vanish when approached from certain angles, always shrouded in mist, always just beyond the reach of confirmation. The testimonies of those who sought these places follow a pattern. At first, their accounts are clear, detailed, documented with the precision of trained observers. They describe packing supplies, chartering boats, entering coordinates into GPS systems that guide them toward regions marked blank on the impossible map. But as they draw closer to their destinations, their journals grow strange. The handwriting shifts. The observations become poetic, less concerned with measurement and more with feeling. One explorer wrote, "The mist here has weight. It presses against thought. I find myself remembering things I never experienced, places I have never been. The island is there, I can feel it more than see it. But every time I try to approach, the distance remains constant, as if the space between us expands at exactly the rate I close it." Another recorded, "We found the valley yesterday, or perhaps it found us. The map showed it empty, and empty it remains. But the emptiness is full of something I cannot name. My crew refuses to enter. They say the silence there is too loud, that it speaks in a language that hurts to understand. I went alone. I will not describe what I saw, because I do not trust that I saw anything. But I am changed. The valley knew me, knew what I carried inside all the empty places where I pretend to be whole." Their voices grow distant after these encounters. Their accounts become fragmentary, trailing off mid-sentence, journals left unfinished as if the writers simply stopped being interested in recording, or stopped believing that words could carry what they experienced. Some return to civilization and live quiet lives, speaking rarely of what they found. Others do not return at all, though search parties find no trace of disaster, no evidence of violence or accident, only abandoned camp supplies neatly arranged and sometimes carved into trees or scratched into stone, that same symbol from the wax seal. Spirals within spirals, eyes watching from the boundary between known and remembered. Beneath the silence of academic debate, a different conversation has emerged, not in journals or conferences, but in letters exchanged between those who have held the map, who have traced its impossible lines with their own fingers and felt something shift inside them. They speak of the map as if it were not a representation of geography, but geography itself, a place you can enter not by traveling, but by becoming the right kind of empty. They suggest that the blank spaces are not absent of content, but full of possibility. Territories that exist in potential until the right observer brings them into being through the act of seeking. That the old Earth remembering is not metaphor but literal truth, the planet itself holding memories of configurations it once held or might yet hold, landscapes that exist in dimensions perpendicular to the three we navigate daily. Some believe the map is a test, that it shows not where to go, but whether you are capable of going. That the cities marked for the future were not predictions but instructions, and the blank spaces are invitations to those brave enough or broken enough to accept. The map remains in its chamber, behind its protective glass. Scholars continue to study it, continue to measure and analyze and debate. Carbon dating gives contradictory results: medieval, ancient, modern, all at once, as if the vellum exists in multiple times simultaneously. The ink refuses to surrender its composition. The coordinates, when plotted, sometimes align with our world, and sometimes suggest a globe with different proportions, a planet slightly larger or smaller, rotating at a different speed through a sky where familiar stars have moved. And those who have seen it, really seen it, not just glanced at a photograph or read a description, but stood before the actual document and let their eyes follow its impossible lines, they carry something afterward. A question, a hunger, a sense that geography is more fluid than we wish to believe, that the world has seams we are not meant to notice, places where reality grows thin and something older shows through. Perhaps the map was never meant to guide us to a location, but to a realization that some territories exist only for those who carry the right kind of emptiness within them, that the blank spaces are not absences but mirrors, reflecting back what we dare not name in ourselves. Or perhaps the cartographer, whoever they were, whenever they truly lived, simply drew what they saw when they closed their eyes, drew the world as it exists in that space between waking and sleep, where all times are simultaneous and all places touch. Drew not the earth as it is, but as it remembers being, as it dreams of becoming. The map waits, behind glass, behind theories, behind the certainty we use to navigate our days, still precise in its impossibility, still suggesting journeys that have no destination, only transformation, still leading not outward into the world, but inward into shadow where the old earth remembers, and we finally might remember too.
The city that faded with the moonlight, there is a quality of silence that belongs only to deserts at night. Not the absence of sound, but something deeper, a presence that listens, that waits, that watches with the patience of stone and sand and stars that have looked down upon emptiness for millennia. It is in this silence, when the moon rises full and the air grows cool enough to carry secrets, that some travelers report seeing what should not be there. A city, white stone gleaming in the distance, silver spires catching moonlight and holding it, as if the towers themselves were woven from luminescence rather than built from any earthly material. Gardens visible even from afar, lush and impossible in landscapes where nothing should grow. And movement, the suggestion of citizens walking streets, tending to lives, existing in a place that appears on no map and vanishes with the changing of the moon's face. They say it was visible only during certain lunar phases, when the veil between what is and what was grows thin as silk. When the boundary separating now from then becomes permeable, when the desert remembers what it once held and, for a few nights, chooses to show rather than conceal. The accounts span centuries and continents, yet they share an eerie consistency that defies explanation. A Roman merchant traveling the Silk Road kept a journal that survived in fragments preserved by chance in a monastery library, that burned in the 14th century pages saved because they had been used to reinforce the binding of another book. In his final entries, written in a hand that grew increasingly unsteady, he described encountering the city during a full moon while his caravan sheltered from a sandstorm. He drew sketches, towers with proportions that violated classical architecture, gardens arranged in spirals, gates that seemed to exist in multiple planes simultaneously. He claimed the city welcomed him, that the gates opened, though no hand touched them, that he walked streets paved with stone that felt like water beneath his feet, that citizens moved past him like reflections and still water aware of his presence, but unable or unwilling to acknowledge him. He wrote that he stayed only hours, but returned to his caravan aged, changed, carrying knowledge he could not articulate. His final notation before his death 3 days later: I have been to where time pools and eddies. I have drunk from fountains that flow upward. I am no longer entirely of this world. Medieval pilgrims, traveling routes to holy sites, described it as the dwelling place of angels in exile. Beings too luminous for heaven, too compassionate for hell, dwelling in an in-between place that manifested only when the moon was full enough to cast shadows, but not yet bright enough to banish mystery entirely. Their accounts appear in illuminated manuscripts, margins filled with sketches of towers that catch light and hold it of, gardens where flowers bloom in colors that have no names, releasing perfume so profound that those who smell it weep without knowing why. One pilgrim wrote, "We saw the city from a distance of perhaps 3 miles. My companions fell to their knees in prayer, believing it to be the New Jerusalem descended from prophecy. But I knew with a certainty that chilled my soul that this was something older, something that existed before our scriptures, before our gods learned to speak in human language. We walked toward it for what seemed like hours, but the distance never decreased. And then the moon set and the city went with it, and we were alone in the desert with only the memory of silver spires fading into dawn." In modern times, the testimonies continue. Hikers stumble into online forums, sharing photographs of a distant skyline glimpsed while camping in remote regions, the Sahara, the Gobi, the Australian outback, the Atacama. The photographs, when compared, reveal an unsettling truth. They are identical. Not similar, not reminiscent of each other, but exactly the same. The same configuration of towers, the same angle of light, the same gardens visible at the city's edge. Each photograph taken decades apart, in different deserts, by different witnesses who have never met. Scientists speak of mirages, of thermal inversions that can create reflections of distant cities, projecting them across hundreds of miles through layers of air that bend light into impossible configurations. They show diagrams, explain the physics of how heat and cold and atmospheric pressure can conjure images from nothing. But this explains nothing of the consistency, nothing of the architectural details that match no known style, not Roman, not Islamic, not Asian, not indigenous to any culture that has left its mark on human history. Nothing of the gardens which witnesses describe with botanical precision, flowers with petals that spiral in Fibonacci sequences, trees whose branches move in patterns that suggest consciousness rather than wind, fountains that flow upward before gravity remembers to claim them. Nothing of the citizens, those figures that move through the city's streets like memories, given form aware of observers but existing in a different stream of time, unable to turn their heads and meet the eyes of those who watch from beyond the veil. Beneath the silence of academic dismissal, a different kind of research has emerged. Individuals who have spent years triangulating the sightings, mapping probability zones based on thousands of accounts. They have identified regions where the city appears most frequently, always in deserts, always during specific lunar phases, always in places where ancient civilizations once flourished and then vanished, leaving only fragments and questions. These researchers camp in the identified zones, waiting with cameras and instruments and journals they fill during long nights of watching. Their equipment often fails at the crucial moment cameras malfunction. Compasses spin, GPS units display impossible coordinates. But their journals remain, and as the nights accumulate, as they spend month after month in these liminal spaces, the entries grow strange. They begin to dream of white stone corridors, of walking through halls that echo with footsteps not their own, of a language that sounds like wind through empty rooms, comprehensible in the moment of hearing but untranslatable upon waking. They describe feeling changed feeling as though something has been added or removed from their essential nature, some quality that made them fully of this world now diluted by exposure to something that exists adjacent to reality rather than within it. One researcher wrote, "I have seen it 3 times now. Each time I understand less and believe more." A city is not a mirage. It is not a reflection. It is a place that exists in the seam between moments, in the space where moonlight touches sand and for reasons we cannot fathom. The barrier between dimensions thins enough for both to become briefly visible to each other. I walked closer this time than ever before. Close enough to hear music, if music is the right word, emanating from the towers. Close enough to smell the gardens, fragrances that made me remember being born, remember dying, remember states of existence I have never experienced. And then the moon moved, slipped behind a cloud, and when it emerged, the city was gone. I am beginning to suspect that the city is not moving through space, but through time. And what we see are moments when its orbit and ours briefly align, the testimonies of those who claim to have entered the city, not merely glimpsed it from a distance, but actually walked its streets, are the most difficult to dismiss and the most impossible to verify. They describe towers whose interiors are larger than their exteriors, rooms that open onto gardens that open onto rooms in impossible loops of space. They speak of citizens who finally acknowledged them, turned faces that were beautiful and terrible, spoke in that wind language that conveyed meaning without words. These witnesses return changed. Not physically, though some claim to have aged differently, time having moved at wrong speeds during their visit, but internally, spiritually, carrying an alteration that others sense without being able to name. They move through the world afterward like people who have remembered something essential and forgotten everything trivial, their priorities rearranged by exposure to a place where the rules that govern our reality do not fully apply. Some believe the city is a memory, that long ago, before the deserts were deserts, a civilization existed there, perhaps human, perhaps not, and built something so profound, so perfectly aligned with fundamental patterns of reality that it could not fully die. That it still exists, not in our dimension of space and time, but in a parallel configuration, and during certain lunar phases, when conditions align precisely, the membrane separating our worlds grows transparent enough for witnessing. Others suggest it is not a memory, but a prophecy. A city that will be built in ages yet to come, its image somehow bleeding backward through time, visible to those who stand in the right places with the right kind of openness. A destination for humanity's distant descendants, or perhaps for consciousness itself when it has evolved beyond the need for permanent physical form. And there are those who whisper that it is neither past nor future, but eternal present. A place that exists outside the flow of time entirely, accessible not by traveling through space, but by achieving a particular state of being. That the city appears in deserts because deserts are places of emptiness, of silence, of absence that makes room for presence of a... That the moon's phases matter because moonlight has always been the light of the liminal, the in-between, the bridge between the seen world and the worlds beyond seeing. The chapter closes as the moon wanes, as the possibility of seeing fades with the light. The researchers pack their equipment, their journals filled with observations that cannot be published, with experiences that cannot be explained. The forums go quiet for another month, waiting for the next cycle, the next reports from travelers who will stumble across something that should not be there. And somewhere, in a desert whose name appears on maps, but whose true nature remains unmarked and unknown, white stone towers catch the fading moonlight. Gardens bloom in impossible spirals. Citizens move through streets, living lives that mirror ours but reflect them from an angle that changes everything. The city remains, if remain is the right word, for something that appears and disappears, for something that might exist in all moments or no moment, for something that waits with infinite patience for the next traveler to stand in the right place at the right time with the right emptiness inside them. Perhaps it was never meant to be reached, only witnessed. Never meant to be understood, only remembered. Perhaps some places exist not to be destinations, but to remind us that the world is larger and stranger and more luminous than our waking hours suggest. That between what is and what was, between what might be and what never can be, there are cities of silver and white stone where the rules we know dissolve into moonlight. And we for a few precious hours might glimpse what we are when we are not entirely ourselves. The moon sets. The desert returns to darkness. The silence resumes its patient watching. And the city fades, as it always has, as it always will, until the next moon rises full enough to thin the veil again.
The instrument that played itself in empty rooms in the beginning. There was silence, the kind that accumulates in forgotten places, in basements sealed behind doors that have not been opened, in living memory, in chambers where dust settles like snow that never melts and air grows thick with the weight of years passing unwitnessed. In such a place, beneath a conservatory that no longer offers tours, behind locks that have rusted into permanence, stands an instrument that should not exist. It rises from the stone floor like a question made manifest. Part organ, its pipes ascending toward vaulted ceilings lost in shadow. Part clockwork mechanism, gears and wheels of brass and iron meshing in configurations that suggest purpose without revealing it. And strung throughout, connecting components that have no business being connected. Wires made from a metal that conducts sound, but not electricity, a substance that analysis cannot name, that seems to exist in the space between known elements, obeying laws of physics we have not yet written. The mystery is not merely in its construction, though that alone would warrant lifetimes of study. The mystery is in its behavior. When left alone, when all human presence withdraws and the door seals shut and silence reclaims the chamber it plays. It is said that the first curator to discover this truth entered the basement at dawn, keys heavy in his hand, tasked with cataloging the conservatory's forgotten instruments before the building was sold. He unlocked the door expecting dust and silence, and the melancholy of abandoned things. Instead, he found music fading into the walls, notes lingering like incense, the air itself still vibrating with harmonies that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The instrument stood silent, its pipes held no breath, its strings hung still, yet the music continued to dissipate around him as if he had interrupted a performance meant only for the empty room, for the dust motes drifting in the thin light that filtered through windows no one had cleaned in decades. He waited, listened, and when the last echoes had dissolved into stone, when silence had fully returned, he turned to leave. But as his hand touched the door, as he pulled it closed behind him, the music began again. Soft at first, a single note, held long and pure, then others joining, weaving patterns of such mathematical beauty that he found himself weeping without understanding why. He opened the door, the music stopped, he closed it. After a pause, as if the instrument were considering, confirming his absence, the music resumed. This was 200 years ago, or 300, or 5. The records conflict, or perhaps the instrument's age is simply beyond recording. What remains consistent is the phenomenon. When observed, it is silent. When left alone, it sings. Engineers came, drawn by rumors that grew like vines through the academic underground. They dismantled portions of the mechanism with the reverence of surgeons, documenting each gear and spring and wire, mapping connections that defied conventional understanding. The pipes, when examined, should not produce the tones they clearly produce. Their lengths are wrong, their diameters calculated for frequencies that don't match the sounds recorded. The strings, when plucked, vibrate in patterns that violate harmonics, creating overtones that should cancel each other, but instead blend into chords that sound like starlight, if starlight could be heard. One engineer spent 3 years studying the clockwork components. His journal, preserved in the conservatory's archive, grows increasingly poetic as his understanding decreases. The final entry reads, "The mechanism does not generate sound. It translates something else into sound. What that something is, I can no longer speculate while maintaining my sanity, but I am certain the instrument is not playing music. It is transcribing. From where, from what, I dare not imagine. Musicians attempted to play it manually, believing human touch might unlock secrets that observation could not. They approached with scores written specifically for its unique configuration, compositions that attempted to work within the constraints its design suggested. But the instrument resisted their touch. Keys that should depress would not move. Strings that should vibrate remained stubbornly still. Pipes that should sound remained silent, as if the instrument were designed for different hands, or perhaps for no hands at all. One renowned organist, after hours of unsuccessful attempts, finally withdrew from the chamber in frustration. She stood outside, listening through the closed door. 5 minutes passed. 10. And then, the instrument began to play her composition, the one she had just attempted, but transformed. Every note she had written was there, but woven with harmonies she had not imagined, developed with mathematical precision into variations that revealed meanings she had not known the melody contained. She never played publicly again. Those who knew her said she spent her remaining years trying to recapture what the instrument had shown her, chasing an understanding that remained always just beyond reach. Psychologists were consulted, suggesting mass hallucination, shared delusion, the power of expectation to create experiences from nothing. They spoke of infrasound, of vibrations too low to hear that could trigger emotional responses and auditory hallucinations. They were confident in their explanations until recordings were made. Microphones placed throughout the chamber, left running overnight, captured performances that happened only when no one listened. The recordings were analyzed by computers that found within them mathematical constants not discovered until centuries after the instrument's presumed construction. The golden ratio appearing in phrase lengths, pi encoded in rhythmic patterns, harmonies that corresponded precisely to frequencies detected in deep space, the cosmic background radiation shaped into melody, rhythms that match the human heartbeat during deep meditation, during REM sleep, during the moments between waking and dreaming when consciousness loosens its grip on linear time. Beneath the silence of what could be explained, a deeper mystery emerged. The compositions were never the same, yet always consistent. Each night brought new music, yet analysis revealed that all the pieces were variations on a single, infinitely complex theme, as if the instrument were not playing different songs, but revealing different facets of one eternal composition, approaching it from angles that shifted with the stars, with seasons, with alignments no human calendar marked. Whispers tell us of those who have heard it, not recordings, but the actual sound, standing outside the chamber door during its nocturnal performances. They describe being changed, not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, over months and years, as if the music had planted something dormant in their minds that bloomed later in unexpected ways. One listener, a physicist, began dreaming of places she could not name. Landscapes where geometry operated differently, where 3 dimensions were merely the surface of spaces that folded through 5, through 7, through infinities of extension. She filled notebooks with equations that described these impossible topologies, mathematics that worked only if certain constants were different, if the universe bent in ways our instruments cannot measure. Her colleagues thought she had become unwell, until decades later when quantum physics stumbled toward theories that echoed her dream mathematics with uncomfortable precision. Another listener, a linguist, reported hearing the music as language, not metaphorically, but literally, each note a phoneme, each phrase a sentence, each composition a discourse on subjects he could not translate, but somehow comprehended in the moment of hearing. He spent years trying to develop notation that could capture what he understood, creating symbols that resembled no alphabet, arranging them in patterns that looked like music scores and architectural blueprints and star charts simultaneously. His work was dismissed as the obsession of a brilliant mind gone astray until cryptographers examining it discovered that his symbols, when arranged according to rules he never explicitly stated, generated sequences that matched patterns found in DNA and crystalline structures in the distribution of prime numbers. The music, it seemed, was not meant for ears alone. Or perhaps ears were merely one way to perceive what the instrument offered, the resonance touching something deeper, some chamber within human consciousness that recognizes what it cannot comprehend, that knows without knowing how it knows. Scientists speak of the instrument now with careful language, hedging their statements with qualifications. They call it an anomaly, an outlier, a puzzle that requires further study. But late at night, in conversations that happen away from recording devices and official journals, some admit a different truth. The instrument is not playing music in any conventional sense. It is translating, receiving signals from sources they cannot identify and converting them into sound that human neurology can process, if barely. Some believe it is listening to the universe itself, to the background hum of existence, and translating that vast, incomprehensible symphony into fragments humans can withstand. Others suggest it is attuned to consciousness, not individual minds, but consciousness as a field, as a fundamental property of reality, and what it plays is the sound of awareness perceiving itself, the universe becoming conscious of its own existence through the medium of mathematics-made melody. And there are those who whisper, in voices that tremble with something between awe and dread, that the instrument is not receiving but transmitting, that its performances are messages sent to receivers we cannot detect, communications with intelligences that exist in dimensions adjacent to ours, reports on the state of consciousness in this particular fold of spacetime, that we are not listeners but subjects of observation, our responses to the music forming data that flows outward to places we cannot imagine. The instrument stands in its chamber still, protected, sealed, silent during the day, when footsteps might echo in corridors above, when human voices might carry through stone. But at night, when the conservatory settles into darkness, when the last visitors have departed and the last doors have closed, it plays. Curators who work late report hearing it, faint and far away, melodies that seem to come from beneath the building, from inside the walls, from the air itself. They do not try to approach. Something in the music suggests it is not meant for direct encountering, that listening too closely might change something essential, might open doorways in consciousness that cannot be closed again. The chapter closes as it began, in silence. but a different silence now, one that contains the possibility of music, the potential for sound to emerge from emptiness and speak truths that language cannot hold. One that acknowledges that some instruments are not tools but thresholds, that some music is not art but communication, that some sounds are not meant to be heard, but to be absorbed, to work their changes slowly. In the deep structures where thought becomes form and consciousness recognizes its own reflection in the vast, resonant chamber of existence itself. The instrument waits in darkness, patient, eternal, ready to play for no one, for everyone, for whatever attention exists beyond the veil of ordinary perception. And somewhere, in the spaces between notes, in the silence that connects sounds, meaning accumulates like water behind a dam-held building, waiting for the moment when it will finally overflow, and we will understand, perhaps, that we have been listening to prayers, to prophecies, to conversations between dimensions of reality we navigate without knowing, speaking languages we comprehend only in dreams. Until then, the music continues, the instrument plays, and the empty room listens with an attention older than stone, deeper than silence, patient as the slow turning of stars in their appointed courses through the infinite dark. The library beneath the waking world there exists, if we trust the testimonies, a place that cannot be reached by walking. No coordinates mark its location, no map shows the path, no door in any waking city opens onto its halls. Yet across centuries and continents scholars and mystics describe the same destination. A library of infinite corridors, shelves, ascending beyond sight, volumes bound in materials that exist nowhere in the physical world, their pages inscribed with wisdom that transforms the moment it is perceived. They call it by many names: the Akashic Library, the Hall of Records, the Archive of what was and will be. Some speak of it as the mind of the universe made manifest, others as a pocket dimension where all knowledge pools like light in a sacred vessel. But the names matter less than the consistent testimony can be visited if one knows the way. And the way is not through space, but through consciousness itself. It is said that entry requires a particular quality of sleep, not the deep unconsciousness that erases the self, nor the shallow rest that holds us close to waking's shore, but that liminal state between, where thought loosens from the body and becomes experience without the burden of flesh. Dreams prepared with intention, meditations that reach specific depths, where the breath slows until it almost ceases and awareness expands beyond the boundaries of skull and skin. Let us begin, as the dreamers begin, with historical accounts. In ancient Greece, philosophers spoke of receiving wisdom through what they called sacred sleep. Plato himself wrote of knowledge as remembering, suggesting that learning was not acquiring new information, but recovering what the soul already knew from before its imprisonment in matter. Some scholars suggest he spoke literally, that his philosophy came not from debate in sunlit forums, but from nocturnal visits to a place where eternal forms could be directly perceived, transcribed upon waking into dialogues that would shape human thought for millennia. Medieval manuscripts preserve testimonies of monks who practiced techniques of contemplative prayer, reaching states where, they claimed, they entered halls of divine knowledge. They described endless corridors lit by no visible source, walls lined with volumes that contained not words but pure understanding, absorbed through sight the way breath is absorbed through lungs. One manuscript, carefully preserved in a monastery archive, contains a detailed account. I found myself in a place that was not a place, surrounded by books that were not books. When I opened one, I did not read, I knew. The knowledge flowed into me like water into a vessel, and I understood, briefly, the nature of time, how all moments exist simultaneously, how past and future are merely directions of travel through an eternal now. But upon waking, I'd recall only the feeling of understanding, not the understanding itself, as if I had brought back only the empty vessel, the water having leaked away during the ascent to consciousness. In the Renaissance, inventors and artists spoke of receiving their greatest insights through dreams. Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks contain references to nocturnal visions, where mechanical principles were revealed to him with perfect clarity. Tesla, centuries later, described accessing knowledge through a state he called the dreamless sleep of consciousness, claiming his inventions came to him fully formed, requiring only transcription from some eternal blueprint. Poets and writers have always claimed their work comes from beyond themselves. Coleridge spoke of composing Kubla Khan in an opium dream, transcribing what he saw in that other place, until an interruption severed the connection and the poem remained forever incomplete. Mary Shelley received Frankenstein in a dream so vivid she merely recorded what she witnessed. They described not creating but copying, transcribing verses from books that disintegrated as they turned pages, racing to capture what they could before the return to waking scattered the words like ash. Whispers tell us that modern accounts continue this ancient pattern. Researchers studying lucid dreaming, the art of becoming conscious within the dream state, report that skilled practitioners sometimes encounter structures not of their own creation. Libraries that feel older than personal memory, that contain knowledge the dreamer did not know they possessed. Some have learned to induce these experiences deliberately, using techniques refined over years of practice, specific breathing patterns before sleep, visualizations held at the threshold of unconsciousness, intentions set with the precision of mathematicians defining equations. Their testimonies share eerie consistency. They describe architecture that defies Euclidean geometry, corridors that curve back on themselves without forming circles, staircases that descend and ascend simultaneously, rooms larger than the buildings that contain them. They speak of a catalog system based not on subject, but on intention. You find the book you need by needing it, by holding the question with sufficient clarity that the relevant volume simply appears in your hand or manifests on a nearby shelf, as if the library responds to consciousness itself rather than conscious searching. Some report meeting other visitors, figures that seem as real as any waking person, engaged in their own studies, absorbed in their own revelations. Conversations happen, though whether in language or pure transference of meaning varies by account. Some claim to have met historical figures, philosophers and scientists from ages past, still pursuing knowledge in this timeless space. Others encounter beings they cannot classify, presences that feel human yet somehow more, or less, or different in ways that resist description. Beneath the silence of skeptical dismissal, theoretical frameworks have emerged to explain what might be happening. Jung spoke of the collective unconscious, that deep stratum of psyche shared by all humanity, containing archetypes and memories that predate individual existence. Perhaps the library is this unconscious made manifest, accessible through the symbolic language of dreams, a place where all human knowledge pools in forms that consciousness can perceive and occasionally retrieve. Quantum physicists speak of information as fundamental to reality, suggest that consciousness itself might be a quantum phenomenon, that knowledge could exist in states perpendicular to our ordinary dimensions of space and time. Perhaps the library exists in such a state, not nowhere, but in a configuration of reality we access through altered consciousness, when the quantum nature of awareness becomes pronounced enough to bridge ordinarily separate domains. Mystical traditions have always maintained that multiple dimensions of existence coexist, layered like silk scarves, each visible through the others, but requiring specific techniques to access directly. The library, in this framework, is not metaphor but geography, a real place in a real dimension, reached not by traveling through our space, but by shifting consciousness to the frequency where that space becomes navigable. The mystery deepens when we consider what these travelers bring back. Not proof, never proof. No volume can be carried across the threshold. The books, when removed from the library, become smoke, become memory, become the sensation of having held something precious that dissolves at the moment of grasping. Those who wake with pages clutched in dreaming hands find only their own fingers, empty. Yet something returns with them. Scientists describe waking with solutions to problems they had abandoned as unsolvable, equations complete in their minds, requiring only transcription. Artists speak of creative breakthroughs, entire symphonies or novels arriving fully formed, needing only the tedious work of recording what was received. Philosophers report shifts in understanding so profound, they spend years unpacking implications that arrived in a single moment of dream contact with knowledge vast as oceans. The influence ripples through their work like dye through water, coloring everything that follows, subtly transforming their perspective, their priorities, their sense of what questions matter and what answers might be possible. They cannot always articulate what changed, only that something did, some fundamental reorientation occurred, as if they briefly glimpsed the whole, and can no longer mistake parts for completion. One researcher, after years studying this phenomenon, wrote, "The library does not give us knowledge in the way a book gives information. It gives us relationship with knowledge, teaches us how to hold questions without needing immediate answers, how to trust that understanding will arrive when consciousness has prepared adequate ground. Those who visit return not with facts but with orientation, with a sense of how to navigate uncertainty, with faith that wisdom exists even when we cannot access it, with patience that allows insight to arrive in its own time. Where memory fades into the softness of approaching sleep, techniques emerge, practices used by dreamers across ages to seek this place. Set intention before sleep, they say. Hold a question as you drift, not grasping but offering it gently to whatever consciousness you become when waking you dissolves. Some visualize a door, a gate, a threshold, and imagine stepping through as awareness loosens from the body. Others use mantras, phrases repeated until words become rhythm, becomes breath, becomes the bridge that carries consciousness across. Keep a journal by the bed. Upon waking, before moving, before opening eyes fully, capture what fragments remain, not in the belief that you will record the knowledge itself, but because the act of recording strengthens the pathway, makes future visits more accessible, more likely. Practice presence in waking life. The library, some say, appears most readily to those who have learned to be fully conscious in ordinary moments, who have trained awareness to stay clear and focused regardless of external circumstances. Lucidity in dreams begins with lucidity in life, with noticing, with attention given fully to whatever is. Accept that you may not remember, that the knowledge works on you regardless of conscious recall, rewiring neural pathways, adjusting the substrate of thought in ways that manifest later as intuition, as insight, as creativity that seems to arrive from nowhere. The library gives what you can carry, and sometimes what you carry is not memory but transformation. Marked by the moon and measured by breath, the invitation remains open. The library stands, if standing is the right word, for something that exists outside temporal verbs in dimensions perpendicular to our own, accessible to any consciousness that learns the way. Not elite knowledge, not requiring initiation or secret doctrine, only the willingness to release certainty about the boundaries of possible, to accept that consciousness might be larger than we imagine, might extend into territories we navigate nightly without recognizing where we've been. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not whether the library exists, but why we've forgotten it does. Why cultures that once maintained techniques for access have let them lapse into superstition. Why knowledge encoded in myth and metaphor has been dismissed rather than decoded. Perhaps the library was never lost, only our willingness to seek it, our faith that consciousness opens onto something more than the cramped quarters of individual experience. The chapter closes as consciousness closes each night, not ending but transforming. Not ceasing, but shifting into modes of being that waking cannot fully comprehend or contain. Somewhere, in corridors that wind through depths below the surface of ordinary awareness, volumes wait. Shelves extend beyond horizon. Knowledge accumulates like light in a sacred vessel, patient and eternal, ready to be perceived by any who arrive with questions humble enough and attention clear enough to receive what has always been offered. The library is there, has always been there, will always be there. The only question is whether we remember the way, whether we dare to sleep with intention, whether we trust enough to seek knowledge in the only place it has ever truly resided, not in books written by hands, but in consciousness itself. Vast and luminous and accessible to those who remember that wisdom requires not acquisition but recognition, not grasping but gentle, persistent, patient approach to the threshold where waking dissolves and the deeper knowing begins. The door that opened onto seasons lost, there are doorways carved into stone that lead nowhere, not sealed by later generations, not bricked up to hide secrets or prevent passage, but genuinely without destination, frames of extraordinary craftsmanship opening onto solid rock, thresholds that step into walls, passages designed with meticulous care to frame nothing but the absence of passage itself. They exist in pyramids, hidden behind panels that archaeologists discover during restorations. In cathedrals, concealed within walls thick enough to hold mysteries. In monasteries carved into cliffsides where wind is the only frequent visitor and silence accumulates like snow that never melts. Beautiful doorways, functional hinges, still capable of movement after millennia. Frames decorated with symbols that speak of transition, of crossing, of thresholds between states of being, spirals suggesting cycles, celestial markers indicating specific alignments. Carvings that depict trees in full bloom adjacent to trees bearing fruit, as if the door itself exists in multiple seasons simultaneously. Yet they open onto stone, onto the mountain's heart, onto emptiness framed with care that suggests purpose, intention, meaning now obscured by time's patient erosion of context. But testimonies persist, accounts that span centuries and cultures, telling of a different truth. These doors once opened onto somewhere else, not places in our geography, but time-specific seasons that no longer exist in our world, climates that have vanished, ecosystems that predate human memory, and perhaps human existence itself. It is said that in a monastery high in mountains, whose name has changed with conquering empires and whose stones remember prayers in 7 languages, a 14th-century monk kept a journal. The manuscript survived by accident, preserved in a chest that was walled up during a siege, and rediscovered 6 centuries later when renovations required breaking through what everyone assumed was merely structural support. The monk's early entries are conventional records of daily prayers, reflections on scripture, observations of weather and seasonal changes. But in the spring of his 3rd year at the monastery, the tone shifts. He writes of a doorway discovered during repairs, hidden behind plaster that had been applied so long ago that no living brother remembered what it concealed. The door, when revealed, was beautiful. Cedar or some wood that resembled cedar but showed no signs of age. No warping or cracking despite the moisture that plagued the monastery. The frame was carved with symbols the brothers could not decipher, patterns that suggested stars, suggested seeds, suggested the spirals found in shells and galaxies. Most mysteriously, the door opened onto solid stone. Not a wall built to seal it, but the mountain itself, as if the door had been carved first, and the mountain had grown around it, or as if the door had always been decorative, symbolic, never meant for actual passage. But the monk, rising early for dawn prayers, found the corridor where the door stood filled with light. Not the gray pre-dawn that should have filtered through the monastery's narrow windows, but golden light, warm and full of presence. He approached the door, touched the handle, and without conscious decision, without planning or permission, he opened it. Beyond the threshold, spring. Not the tentative spring of mountains, where snow lingers in shadows and growth proceeds with caution, but a spring of such perfection, it seemed like the concept made manifest. Flowers he did not recognize could not have recognized, we now know, because they were species extinct for millennia growing in abundance. Trees in full bloom releasing fragrances that made him weep with a joy that had no object, no source. Only the pure experience of being alive in that moment, in that light, in that season that existed nowhere in the world he knew. He stepped through. The door closed behind him, though he heard no sound of its closing, felt no wind to move it, and he walked in that endless spring, days bleeding into weeks, weeks into what felt like years. The light never changed, the flowers never faded. Time moved. He could feel himself aging, feel his body growing older, but the season remained constant, perfect, eternal. When he finally found the door again, or when it found him, for he was never certain, he had been searching and stepped back through into the monastery, he discovered that only moments had passed. His brothers were still gathering for dawn prayers, but he had aged decades. His hair had whitened. His joints carried the stiffness of years that had somehow accumulated in minutes. And though he tried to describe what he had experienced, words failed. He could only write, "I have been to where seasons do not pass, but persist. Where spring is not a transition, but a dwelling place. I am ruined for this world now, for I have tasted a perfection that makes all earthly beauty seem like shadow." He died 3 days later. The brothers, uncertain whether to classify his death as madness or miracle, recorded it with careful ambiguity and sealed the door behind fresh plaster, where it remained hidden for 600 years. Beneath the silence of single testimonies, patterns emerge. Archaeologists who study these doorways, and there are more than casual scholarship acknowledges, scattered across continents and structures built by cultures that should have had no contact, note consistencies. Many face specific directions, true east, or toward points on the horizon where certain stars rise during equinoxes. Many align with astronomical events, positioned so that light strikes their thresholds only during rare conjunctions, during moments when the geometry of Earth and stars achieves specific configurations. The symbols carved into their frames repeat across vast distances, spirals suggesting cycles or journeys inward, trees with roots and branches intertwining, eyes that might be stars or portals, patterns that echo both DNA helixes and galaxy spirals. As if the builders understood these doorways operated at scales both intimate and cosmic. Researchers have mapped their locations, discovered they cluster in regions known for other temporal anomalies, places where compasses refuse to point true north, spinning uselessly or indicating directions that shift moment to moment, where chronometers fail, clocks running fast or slow or simply stopping, as if time itself moves with inconsistent velocity, where travelers report experiences of missing time, of journeys that should take hours completed in minutes, or simple walks that somehow consume entire days. Modern attempts to understand have yielded more mystery than clarity. Electromagnetic surveys show nothing unusual. The stone is stone. The wood is wood. No hidden chambers or voids exist where the doors should lead. Quantum physicists, when consulted, grow speculative, suggesting these doorways might mark thin places in spacetime, regions where the membrane between dimensions or timelines grows permeable under specific conditions. They speak of wormholes, of Einstein-Rosen bridges, but on scales so small and so unstable that they manifest only briefly, only when exact alignments occur, alignments the ancient builders somehow understood and marked with their impossible architecture. Mystics offer different frameworks. They claim these doors were built by civilizations that understood time not as linear progression, but as geography, as space that could be navigated if one possessed the correct techniques, that seasons are not sequential but coexistent, all happening simultaneously in dimensions parallel to our own, that autumn and winter and spring and summer exist as separate territories, and these doors, when conditions align, allow passage between them. Some believe the doors lead to seasons Earth once knew, but has lost, climates that prevailed during ages when ice-covered continents or tropical warmth extended to polar regions, that the planet's memory is preserved somewhere, somehow, and these doorways provide access to times when different rules governed, when ecosystems flourished that no fossil record captures completely. Whispers tell us of modern openings, rare and unreliable, witnessed by those who happen to be present during the precise moments when ancient alignments briefly reactivate ancient purposes. An archaeologist working late, alone in a cathedral being restored, heard a sound like wind, though all windows were closed. She turned to find a door she had documented as leading nowhere, standing open. Beyond it, not the wall she had photographed that morning, but mist, and through the mist, the suggestion of forests. She smelled earth and growth, fragrances that reminded her of spring, but richer, more complex, carrying notes that modern flowers never produced. She stood at the threshold, afraid to step through, afraid to step back, caught in the paralysis of witnessing something that violated every certainty she had built her career upon. The moment stretched, then the door swung closed, gentle as a breath, and when she opened it again, hands shaking, heart pounding, only stone waited beyond. Others describe similar experiences. Wrong weather visible beyond thresholds, summer heat wavering in winter air, autumn leaves falling upward, rain that falls in colors not quite matching water's transparency, air carrying fragrances that analysis cannot place, compounds that match no known plant, suggesting flora that existed before humans evolved the language to name them. Sounds of animals long extinct, calls and songs recorded in no field guide, preserved in no recording, heard only by those who stand at these thresholds during moments of impossible opening. Most who try the doors find only stone, but the fact that some find otherwise, that testimonies continue to accumulate across centuries, suggests the doors are not broken, but patient, waiting for conditions we no longer understand how to recognize or create. The chapter closes with an image, a door standing in stone, hinges still functional after ages beyond counting, frames still carved with symbols whose meanings we have forgotten how to read. It waits, as it has always waited, as perhaps it will always wait. Behind it, if the testimonies are true, if the patterns researchers have documented mean what they seem to mean, if mystics and physicists are both correct in their different ways behind it, seasons persist that our world has lost. Springs of perfection, autumns of golden light that lasted centuries, summers when different stars wheeled overhead and different flowers grew in abundance. Perhaps these seasons are memories, preserved in dimensions that exist perpendicular to our timeline, accessible when rare alignments make the walls between times momentarily permeable. Perhaps they are actual places, territories in a geography of time rather than space, where seasons exist as destinations rather than transitions. Or perhaps the doors lead nowhere because we have forgotten how to open them properly, lost the techniques or alignments or states of consciousness required to activate their ancient purpose. Perhaps they wait for descendants of their builders, for individuals who carry specific understandings encoded in blood or soul, for moments when the universe's geometry returns to configurations it held when the doors were new. The door stands, closed, still, silent, but not quite silent. Not to those who listen with more than ears, who sense with more than physical senses, who stand before these thresholds and feel something shifting, something breathing, something waiting with the patience of stone and the hope of seasons for the moment when conditions align, when the door opens not onto emptiness, but onto times we thought had passed, seasons we assumed were gone forever, dwelling in memory and myth, and the carved symbols of doorways that lead, impossibly and beautifully, into what we have lost and might, perhaps, find again. If we remember the way, if we recognize the moment, if we dare to open doors that lead nowhere and trust that nowhere, sometimes, is everywhere we have ever needed to go. The cloth that held no dye, yet bore all colors. There are textures that exist between touch and memory, in private collections guarded by families who have forgotten why they guard them, in museum storage rooms where catalogs list items as fabric origin unknown, properties disputed, there rest fragments of cloth that should not have survived their own age, should not exist at all, if matter obeys the rules we have written to contain it. But the deepest mystery is not in the structure, it is in the color, or rather, in the colors. Plural, simultaneous, impossible. The ancients called it dreamcloth or God's weaving. They believed it was made from the substance of visions made material, thoughts and prayers condensed into threads, and woven by hands that understood secrets we have since forgotten or deliberately abandoned. A merchant's letter survives from the Silk Road's golden age, preserved by chance in a Cairo archive, written in Persian with annotations in 3 other languages as if the writer could not contain his wonder in a single tongue. He describes acquiring a length of this material from a trader who would not name his source, who accepted payment in knowledge rather than gold, who vanished after the transaction as completely as if he had never existed. The merchant brought the cloth home to his family. He saw it as gray, soft, luminous gray like dawn mist over mountains. His wife, upon seeing it, asked why he had purchased green fabric, for to her eyes it shimmered with the color of new leaves, of spring growth, of life emerging from winter's grip. Their daughter, young enough to speak without filtering truth through politeness, insisted it was crimson deep and rich as blood, as sunset, as the heart's hidden chambers. They argued, gently at first, then with increasing bewilderment. Each was certain of what they saw. Each could not understand how the others perceived differently. Finally, the merchant cut 3 pieces, gave 1 to each, sent them to separate rooms. When they returned and placed the fragments together, the pieces matched perfectly in hue, but each person still saw their own color, their own truth, woven into threads that held all possibilities without choosing any. The letter ends abruptly. I have sold the cloth to a temple, for it frightens me, not because it changes, but because it shows us that seeing is not knowing, that the world each person inhabits is their own, and we walk through separate realities believing we share one. This truth was not meant for merchants' eyes. It is said that priests wore robes made from this fabric during sacred rituals, believing the colors revealed spiritual truths. Congregations reported that the garments shifted during ceremonies, glowing brighter when prayers reached certain intensity, darkening when doubts crept into collective consciousness, sometimes displaying patterns that seemed to respond to unspoken questions, as if the cloth itself participated in the sacred dialogue between human and divine. One account preserved in a monastery archive describes a particular mass where the priestess' vestments began cycling through colors no one could name, hues that existed between known color shades that seemed to come from a spectrum invisible to normal sight. Those present reported experiencing synesthesia, seeing sounds, hearing colors, tasting light. Several fainted, others wept. One young monk claimed he understood, briefly, the language angels spoke before the fall, a tongue made of pure chromatic meaning that required no words. The priest himself never spoke of what happened. He removed the vestments afterward and sealed them in lead, in stone, in prayers for containment. They were discovered centuries later by archaeologists who opened the vault expecting treasure, and found only folded fabric, which immediately began shifting through colors responding to their presence. After ages of darkness, patient as only matter that transcends matter can be patient. Healers used it to wrap wounds, claiming the cloth drew out illness by absorbing wrong colors from sick flesh. Medical texts from Persia and India describe techniques of diagnosis based on how the fabric responded to contact with diseased tissue, certain colors indicating fever, others infection, still others maladies of the spirit that manifested through the body. The cloth became diagnostic tool and treatment simultaneously, pulling sickness into itself and somehow transforming it, neutralizing it, releasing it back into the air as something benign. One physician's journal describes a case where cloth applied to a gangrenous wound turned black, then gray, then gradually cycled through colors until returning to the patient's own hue, at which point the wound had healed impossibly fast, leaving no scar. The physician wrote, "The cloth knows what the body should be, and reminds the flesh of its true pattern." I do not understand how fabric can remember health, but I have witnessed it restore what disease had corrupted. Mystics meditated on it, sitting in silent contemplation before fragments hung in darkened rooms, watching as extended observation revealed patterns. They described seeing geometric forms emerge and dissolve, equations written in arrangements of hue and shadow, messages that bypassed language and inscribed themselves directly into consciousness. Some claimed to achieve enlightenment through such meditation. Others emerged changed in ways that terrified their communities, speaking in riddles, seeing through surfaces to the mathematical structures beneath, no longer quite comfortable in normal human social patterns. One mystic's testimony, recorded by a concerned disciple, describes the experience. "I watched the cloth for 40 days. On the first day, I saw colors. On the 10th day, I saw the spaces between colors. On the 20th day, I saw that space itself was made of color invisible to ordinary sight. On the 30th day, the colors began speaking, not in words, but in pure meaning, showing me how reality is woven from threads of possibility, how consciousness collapses infinite potential into single experiences, how we are the weavers and the woven, the observers and the observed." On the 40th day, I understood why this knowledge is hidden in cloth rather than books, because truth this fundamental cannot be contained in language, only experienced through senses we have forgotten we possess. Beneath the silence of medieval wonder, modern science has attempted understanding. Fragments have been examined with every available technology. Spectroscopy reveals that the cloth does not reflect light in normal ways. Photons interact with it and emerge altered, carrying information that was not present before contact, as if the material adds something to light that passes through it. Quantum analysis suggests the fibers exist in superposition, simultaneously possessing multiple properties until observed, at which point they collapse into whatever state the observer's consciousness expects or needs. Under electron microscopes, each thread appears to contain smaller threads, and those contain smaller still, extending into dimensions the instruments cannot quite measure. It is as if the cloth is woven not just in three-dimensional space, but through other dimensions, its structure extending into territories our mathematics barely acknowledges and our instruments cannot detect. The theories proliferate, none entirely satisfactory, quantum states held stable through techniques the ancients understood. But we have lost materials harvested from organisms that no longer exist, perhaps from ecosystems that flourished during ages when Earth's magnetic field or cosmic radiation levels differed enough to allow matter to arrange itself in configurations no longer possible. Substances that exist partially in our dimension while extending into others, acting as bridges between states of reality we perceive as separate. Some physicists suggest the cloth is not changing color, but revealing color, that all objects contain all possible colors in superposition, and normal matter simply lacks the flexibility to display more than one at a time. The dream cloth, in this framework, is matter that has achieved a state of maximal possibility, refusing to collapse into single definite properties, maintaining the quantum uncertainty that usually resolves the moment observation occurs. Whispers tell us of collectors who have gone mad studying these fragments. Their journals start scientifically, filled with measurements and hypotheses and careful documentation. But as weeks become months, as they spend hours each day observing, recording, attempting to understand, the entries shift. They begin describing communication, not hearing voices, but receiving meaning through color, through patterns that emerge when watched with sufficient attention. The hue spelling out secrets in languages made entirely of chromatic information, bypassing ears and entering directly through eyes into the parts of consciousness that process meaning before language shapes it into words. One collector's final entry, before his family had him institutionalized, reads, "The colors are not properties of the cloth. They are the cloth attempting to show us what we truly are, beings of light and frequency, consciousness that has learned to perceive itself through the narrow bandwidth we call visible spectrum. The cloth remembers when we perceived more broadly, when we saw the full range of reality rather than the thin slice evolution selected for survival. It is trying to restore our vision, but the restoration requires surrendering certainty about what is real, accepting that the solid world is illusion, and we are the dreamers dreaming it into temporary solidity. I am ready to surrender. I have seen too much to return to the comfort of believing matter is simple, that color is merely wavelength, that consciousness is merely chemistry. The cloth has shown me the truth, and the truth has made me incompatible with consensus reality, where memory fades into the approach of sleep. A fragment rests under glass in a private collection whose location is not publicly disclosed. It shifts still, gray, becoming green, becoming crimson, becoming colors that have no names, that perhaps have never had names, that exist in the spaces between categories our language provides. The glass that protects it or protects observers from it is thick and treated with coatings that filter specific wavelengths, and attempt to limit its influence while allowing study. But those who have stood before it, who have watched it cycle through its impossible spectrum, report feeling changed. Not dramatically, not immediately, but subtly, progressively, as if exposure planted something that grows slowly in consciousness, altering perception in ways that only become apparent over time. They begin noticing colors in the world that they swear were not there before, shades between familiar hues, chromatic information their eyes suddenly process that was always present, but previously invisible. They describe the experience as both gift and curse, seeing more richly, but also seeing how much else might exist beyond the limits of their still constrained perception. The chapter closes as all mysteries close when sleep approaches, not with answers, but with deepened wonder. The cloth remains, preserved behind glass and guards, and protective spells that might be superstition or might be ancient understanding encoded as ritual. It continues its patient demonstration that matter is stranger than materialism suggests, that color is more than wavelength, that consciousness and substance interact in ways that collapse the boundary between observer and observed. Perhaps the ancients understood properties of reality we are only beginning to suspect. Perhaps they possessed technologies so advanced they appear as magic to eyes trained to recognize only what current science permits. Perhaps the cloth is not ancient at all, but arrives from a future where humanity has learned to weave with quantum threads, and these fragments are messages, invitations, breadcrumbs, leading us toward capabilities we will someday recover or discover. Or perhaps the cloth simply is existing without needing permission from our theories, displaying properties without requiring our understanding, holding all colors because it exists in a state closer to the fundamental nature of reality than the collapsed singular definite matter we mistake for the only form substance can take. It waits as it has always waited, as perhaps it will always wait, shifting, shimmering, showing each observer their own truth, while suggesting that truth itself is woven from threads more numerous and more luminous than any single perspective can capture, that reality is richer than our instruments can measure, that the ancients might have known what we are only beginning to remember, that seeing is not passive reception but active creation, that consciousness shapes matter as surely as matter shapes consciousness, and that the world each person inhabits is their own, woven from threads of perception, dyed in colors unique to their soul, yet somehow part of a larger tapestry none of us can see completely, a pattern so vast and intricate that only God, or whatever dreamed us all into being, can comprehend the whole. The cloth shifts, the colors flow, the mystery endures, patient and beautiful, and absolutely, impossibly real. The echo that traveled backward through time. In the beginning, or perhaps at the end, there is silence. Not the simple absence of sound, but the pregnant quiet that exists before speaking, before thought becomes breath, becomes vibration, becomes meaning carried through air. The silence that contains all possible sounds, waiting to be released, or perhaps already released in moments yet to come. Their echoes reaching backward to touch the present with whispers of what will be. In certain caves carved deep into mountains whose names have changed with empires, in canyons where wind has shaped stone into configurations that should not resonate, but do. In architectural spaces built with purposes, now wrapped in the dust of forgotten intention, sound behaves impossibly. Travelers report hearing their own words return to them before speaking them, hearing responses to questions they have not yet asked, listening to conversations that will happen hours hence, voices clear and distinct, discussing events that have not yet occurred, but will, with unsettling accuracy, fold exactly as the echoes predicted. Scientists call it acoustic anomaly. They speak of unusual geological formations, of standing waves and constructive interference, of rock densities and chamber geometries that create unexpected sonic behaviors. But their explanations falter when confronted with the specificity. Why these locations and not others with similar structures? Why do the phenomena happen reliably in places humans deliberately constructed, amphitheaters, temples, meditation chambers, spaces designed with knowledge we no longer possess for purposes we can no longer name? The mystery begins not with sound, but with time, with the contemplation of what it means for effect to precede cause, for echo to arrive before the call that generates it. It is said that ancient oracles built their reputations not on divine inspiration, but on acoustic understanding. They knew certain chambers, certain positions within sacred architecture, where time's normal flow grew turbulent, where future sounds bled backward into the present like ink through water, staining the moment with knowledge that should not yet exist. The oracle at Delphi sat in chambers carved from living rock, positioned precisely at coordinates that aligned with underground waters, with fissures that released gases, with geometries that focused and reflected sound in ways that bent its temporal properties. Pilgrims asked their questions, and the oracle breathing vapors sitting in acoustic sweet spots, where time rent strange heard not just the questions, but the answers she would give. The outcomes those answers would generate, the conversations that would ripple forward through years of consequence. She was not prophesying, she was listening, hearing her own future voice speaking backward through carefully engineered stone, through acoustic channels designed by architects who understood that sound moves through time as surely as through space, and that with correct geometry, those movements can be redirected, reversed, made to flow upstream against causality's current. Whispers tell us of theaters in ancient Greece, where specific seats allowed observers to hear performances moments before they began. Not previews or rehearsals, but the actual performance displaced in time, actors' voices arriving at certain positions before leaving the actors' mouths, traveling backward through acoustic pathways that looped through moments like rivers looping through landscape. These were not accidents. The architecture was deliberate, refined over generations, encoding knowledge that treated time as dimension rather than destiny, as space that could be navigated with proper technique. Seats were marked with symbols, spirals suggesting cycles, Ouroboros images of serpents eating their own tails, representations of time as circular rather than linear. The privileged few who occupied these positions reported strange experiences, hearing their own reactions before the events that would trigger them, their gasps of surprise preceding the surprising moments, their laughter echoing from seconds ahead. Some found it unsettling, this evidence that their responses were predetermined, already occurring in a future they had not yet reached. Others found it liberating, proof that past and future existed simultaneously, that the present was merely the moving point of consciousness traveling through a landscape where all moments were equally real, equally present, merely separated by the direction of perception's gaze. Mystics sought these places deliberately, understanding them as thresholds where communion with one's own future self became possible. They would sit in meditation in caves or chambers known for temporal acoustic anomalies, and listen, not for external voices, but for their own, speaking from days or years ahead, offering warnings or encouragements or simply confirmation that they would survive to speak them. One account, preserved in a Tibetan monastery, describes a practice called listening to the elder you. Monks would enter a specific chamber at dawn, sit in designated positions, and wait in silence. After hours of meditation, some reported hearing themselves' voices age by years, offering guidance on decisions not yet faced, describing outcomes of choices not yet made. The monastery kept records of these encounters, comparing what was heard with what eventually unfolded, documenting accuracy rates that defied chance and suggested genuine temporal information transfer. The practice was discontinued when several monks reported hearing their own death songs, traditional chants performed during final moments, returning through the acoustic channels from futures that had not yet arrived. The knowledge proved too heavy. Knowing when and how one would die, hearing one's own final words years in advance, disrupted the monk's ability to live fully in the present. The chamber was sealed, remains sealed, though some claim that on quiet mornings, if you stand near the blocked entrance, you can still hear voices, prayers, and death songs, warnings and prophecies, all tangled together in temporal impossibility. Beneath the silence of historical accounts, modern documentation continues the strangeness. Researchers equipped with recording devices have captured the phenomenon. Audio played back reveals voices speaking words not yet said, conversations that unfold after the recording ends exactly matching the conversation captured before it began. Footsteps that approach before anyone has decided to walk. Doors closing before anyone touches them. The sound of closure preceding the action by seconds or minutes. The effect is unreliable, maddeningly inconsistent. It appears strongest during specific times, equinoxes and solstices, moments when celestial alignments match conditions present when the structures were built. It seems to respond to intention, growing more pronounced when visitors approach with openness, with belief in possibility, with the kind of consciousness that refuses to be constrained by consensus about time's direction. Emotional state matters. Those in heightened awareness, grief, joy, meditative calm, the edge of sleep report more frequent and more dramatic experiences, as if consciousness itself plays a role, as if the observer's state of mind helps create the acoustic pathways through which future sounds travel backward. Physicists have explored these spaces with instruments designed to measure what should not vary, the arrow of time itself. Their equipment detects fluctuations, regions where temporal flow shivers and destabilizes. Entropy sometimes decreases locally briefly, before equilibrium reasserts itself. Quantum measurements show correlations that suggest effect preceding cause at scales usually confined to subatomic realms. But here, somehow, scaled to human experience. Theoretical frameworks proliferate. Quantum retrocausality, the phenomenon of future events influencing past states, somehow amplified by acoustic resonance in specific geometric configurations. Ancient technologies that manipulated temporal fields using sound as the controlling mechanism, knowledge lost when the civilizations that developed it collapsed. Natural formations that create closed time-like curves, paths through spacetime that loop back on themselves, but only for acoustic frequencies, allowing sound to travel trajectories forbidden to matter. Some researchers suggest consciousness itself is the key variable, that these spaces don't create temporal anomalies so much as reveal them, showing us what is always true, but usually imperceptible, that time is arrow is convention rather than law, that past and future exist simultaneously, that causality runs in both directions, but we perceive only forward flow, because our neurology evolved to process time linearly, even though reality operates multidirectionally. Where memory fades into sleep's approach, testimonies emerge from those who have conversed with themselves across time. A woman who heard herself, 30 years older, warning her away from a relationship that would bring only sorrow. She heeded the warning, chose differently, and decades later found herself sitting in the same cave, speaking backward to her younger self, closing the causal loop that had saved her life from derailing. A physicist who heard equations before deriving them, his own voice from hours ahead, speaking solutions he had not yet discovered. He transcribed what he heard, followed the mathematical pathways, arrived at conclusions that his future self had already reached, and sent backward as guidance. A dying man who traveled to a canyon known for these effects, hoping to hear whether anything lay beyond, whether consciousness persisted after the body's failure. He reported hearing silence, no future voice responding, no echo returning from beyond death's threshold. But he also reported feeling peace. The silence, he said, was not absence but fullness, not ending but transformation into a state where sound was no longer the proper medium for existence. Their lives bent around these encounters, shaped by knowledge that arrived before its time, by conversations that violated causality's supposed inviolability. Some found the experience liberating, proof that they were not entirely trapped in linear progression, that some part of them existed across temporal dimensions simultaneously. Others found it disturbing, evidence of determinism, suggestion that choices were illusions and futures were fixed, already existing, merely waiting to be reached. The chapter closes as it began, silence, but a different silence now. Not the emptiness before sound, but the fullness after, when echoes have faded, but their meaning lingers, when words have been spoken, but their reverberations continue indefinitely, rippling forward and backward through time, like waves from stones dropped in still water, spreading in all directions, including the one we call past. Perhaps these acoustic anomalies show us something essential about reality's nature, that time is not the river we imagine, flowing in one direction, with past behind and future ahead, but an ocean where all depths and distances exist simultaneously, where waves can move in any direction, where currents sometimes flow upstream and echoes sometimes arrive before the calls that spawn them. Perhaps the ancient architects understood this. Perhaps they built their temples and theaters and meditation chambers as instruments for navigating time's true geography, as maps showing that consciousness can move through temporal dimensions as surely as bodies move through spatial ones. If only we remember the technique, if only we learn again to listen. The silence waits, patient, containing within itself all sounds that have been or will be, all conversations that happened or will happen, all echoes traveling their impossible trajectories through time's hidden architecture. And somewhere, in caves and canyons and chambers designed with knowledge we have lost, your own voice might be speaking even now, calling backward from the future you will inhabit, offering warnings or encouragements, or simply confirmation that you will arrive. That time's strange geography permits such communion, that effect and cause are more entangled than our textbooks teach. The silence listens, the echo proceeds, and we, standing at the center of our own moving moment, might hear if we become quiet enough, open enough, willing enough to believe that time is stranger and more generous than we have been taught, the sounds of our own becoming traveling backward to touch us, to guide us, to remind us that we are always already speaking to ourselves across chasms of causality that appear impassable, but are in truth merely waiting for us to remember how to listen. The chamber waits, the echo returns, and time, that patient teacher, continues its circular instruction, showing us through sound what we forgot through sight, that past and future are directions, not destinations, that now contains both always and never, and that the silence between heartbeats holds all the conversations we will ever have, waiting to be heard by ears that have learned to listen not just forward but backward, not just to what was, but to what will be, and to what eternally is, the eternal present dressed in the illusion of sequence, the timeless wearing time's mask, the infinite expressing itself through the finite geometry of moments we mistake for the whole of existence. Listen, the echo approaches, and it carries your voice, speaking words you have not yet learned, from a time you have not yet reached, offering knowledge you already possess, but have temporarily forgotten, that you are the speaker and the listener, the question and the answer, the echo and the call, traveling endlessly through acoustic chambers built by hands that understood what we are only beginning to remember, that time is not the prison we imagine, but the palace where consciousness dwells, moving freely through rooms we call past and future, speaking always to itself, across distances measured not in years, but in awareness, across thresholds marked not by clocks, but by the quality of listening we bring to the eternal now. The silence deepens, the echo fades, and in the space between them, everything that has been or will be, waits, patient as stone, speaking always to those who dare to hear. The garden where nothing ever died. There is a pulse at the heart of all living things, the first beat, the original surge of becoming that separates life from the patience of stone. But what if that pulse never ceased, yet also never progressed? What if the moment of becoming stretched into eternity, neither completing nor ending, caught in an endless rhythm of birth that never arrives and death that never claims, sealed within a valley whose location shifts like water through cupped hands, accessible only through passages that collapse and reform according to patterns no cartographer has successfully mapped? There exists, if the testimonies can be trusted, a place where biological time does not flow forward. A garden, a sanctuary, a trap. The few who claim to have reached it speak in voices that tremble between wonder and warning. They describe flora that cycles through seasons in moments, seeds cracking open and sending roots into soil that is simultaneously spring soft and autumn hard, stalks rising and fruiting and withering and returning to seed in the span of a single breath, trees that grow from saplings to ancient giants and back again in continuous loops, their rings recording centuries that pass in seconds, their leaves budding and falling and budding again in rhythms that make the eye ache to follow. And animals, creatures that age backwards and forwards simultaneously, fawns becoming fawns without pause, without progression, cycling endlessly through the possibilities of their existence, never reaching birth because birth requires an origin, they perpetually circle without touching, never reaching death because death requires an ending, they approach infinitely without arriving. It is said the garden was discovered by accident, as the most sacred and terrible places always are. An alchemist in the 14th century, searching for the philosopher's stone, followed obscure references in texts that predated written history. He wrote of finding a valley where his compass spun uselessly, where the sun seemed to rise and set in the same moment, where he watched a deer collapse in death and spring back to life, in reverse, wounds closing, eyes brightening, the creature leaping away only to age again, in moments to fall again, to rise again, in an endless cycle that filled him with equal measures of awe and horror. He claimed to have spent hours there, or perhaps days, for time inside the valley bore no relationship to time outside it, and when he emerged, he found that no time had passed in the world beyond, or perhaps decades had passed. The accounts conflict, as they always do when temporal certainty dissolves, but he brought something back. A flower, carefully preserved in a vessel sealed with wax and prayers. In his laboratory, the flower behaved impossibly. It bloomed and wilted continuously, its petals opening and closing in rhythms that followed no natural pattern, releasing fragrances that shifted from spring fresh to autumn decay, and back again within single breaths. His apprentices reported that studying it too long induced strange states, memories becoming unstuck from chronology, experiencing childhood and old age simultaneously, feeling themselves exist at multiple points in their lifespans at once. The flower vanished one night, leaving only an empty vessel and a note in the alchemist's hand. Some things are not meant to be removed from their native time, or perhaps all time is native to them, and they simply return to the garden where past and future are the same country. Whispers tell us that naturalists in later centuries sought the valley, believing it held secrets that would revolutionize understanding of biological processes. A Victorian expedition, meticulously documented until its final days, described approaching a valley that seemed to shimmer, as if seen through heat haze despite cool mountain air. Their final entries speak of flora visible from a distance, gardens of impossible vitality, where everything grew and died and grew again in visible cycles. They entered. One returned. The lone survivor, a botanist named Catherine Wells, was found 3 days later, miles from where she should have been, aged to extreme old age despite being 26 when the expedition departed. She lived only hours after her discovery, speaking in fragments about time running in circles, about watching her own hands age and grow young repeatedly, about understanding finally that linear time was the aberration and cyclical time, the true nature of existence. Before dying, she sketched a single image, a flower in multiple states simultaneously: seed, sprout, bloom, fruit, decay, seed again, all existing at once, all equally present, a botanical representation of what physicists would later call superposition. Among her effects, researchers found seeds. They were planted in laboratories across England in greenhouses designed to recreate every possible condition. None germinated, or rather, all of them germinated constantly. Observers reported seeing flickers, suggestions of growth that appeared and vanished too quickly to confirm, as if the seeds were cycling through their lifespans at speeds that made observation impossible, existing in all states at once and therefore visible in none. After 3 months, the seeds vanished completely, leaving only empty soil and the unsettling suggestion that they had returned to the only place where their temporal nature was sustainable, the garden where nothing dies because nothing is ever fully born, where everything exists in the eternal present tense of becoming. Beneath the silence of historical accounts, modern expeditions have attempted to reach the valley using technologies the ancients lacked. Satellites detect nothing. Aerial photography shows only mountains and canyons, normal landscape features that should make the valley easily accessible. But ground expeditions find the terrain refuses to cooperate. Passages that appear on maps prove to be solid stone. Valleys that should exist according to topographical surveys simply aren't there. GPS coordinates lead to different locations each time they're followed, as if the valley moves, or as if space itself rearranges around it, protecting it from discovery or perhaps protecting discoverers from it. Those who claim to have visited and new testimonies appear every few decades, following patterns that suggest the valley becomes accessible during specific temporal windows, describe experiences that challenge every assumption about biological existence. They speak of feeling their own cells stop aging during their time in the valley. Not slowly, not subtly, but absolutely, as if the molecular machinery of senescence simply paused, recognizing it had entered a domain where its usual functions were irrelevant. Wounds healed instantly, flesh knitting back together in moments, not because of accelerated healing, but because the injury and the healed state existed simultaneously, and consciousness could choose which state to inhabit. Most disturbing are reports of memories becoming unstuck from linear time. Visitors describe experiencing their entire lives at once: childhood, adolescence, adulthood, old age, death, all present simultaneously, equally real, equally accessible. They speak of understanding that the person they are at 20 and the person they will be at 80 exist concurrently in the garden is eternal now, that past and future selves can be perceived directly, because the garden exists outside the illusion of temporal sequence. One recent visitor, a physicist who spent her career studying time's nature, returned from a claimed visit changed in subtle ways. She began speaking of time as geography, as a landscape that could be navigated in any direction. Her papers, initially dismissed as evidence of mental breakdown, have recently attracted renewed attention from quantum theorists working on closed time-like curves and retrocausality. She described watching her own decomposition and rebirth simultaneously, seeing her body age into death, while simultaneously growing younger toward birth, both processes happening at once, forever, without either reaching completion. In The Garden, she wrote, "You understand that death and birth are not opposite ends of a line, but opposite directions of travel through the same space. The garden exists at the point where both directions meet and cancel, where movement continues eternally, but arrival never occurs. The theories multiply, none entirely satisfying. A pocket universe where entropy runs backwards, balancing our universe's forward flow, creating a zone where temporal processes cancel each other and biological systems cycle endlessly without net change. An experiment left by an unknown civilization that mastered temporal mechanics, a living laboratory where they studied what happens when time's arrow is removed from biological systems. A natural formation where space-time's geometry folds back on itself in ways that trap causality in loops, where effects become their own causes and nothing can progress, because everything is already complete and beginning simultaneously." Some mystics claim the garden is a wound in time itself, a place where reality was damaged during creation and never fully healed, where the scar tissue of existence behaves differently than healthy spacetime. They suggest it is both sanctuary and prison, offering escape from death, but only by trapping consciousness in an eternal moment of becoming. Neither fully alive nor capable of dying, cycling through existence like prayers repeated until words lose meaning and only the rhythm remains. Where memory fades into sleep's embrace, an image persists, a flower in a garden that exists nowhere and everywhere, blooming and wilting and blooming again in endless rhythm. Its petals open to reveal colors that shift through seasons: spring's tender green, summer's passionate red, autumn's meditative gold, winter's stark white, all present at once, all cycling continuously. Seeds fall and sprout and grow and fruit and decay and return to seeds in motion so continuous it appears still, like a wheel spinning so fast it seems motionless. Around it, the garden extends acres or miles or infinite distances. Reports vary, filled with flora and fauna caught in the same eternal cycle. Birds that hatch and mature and age and decompose and reconstitute as eggs, and flight paths that loop through all stages of existence simultaneously. Insects experiencing their entire life cycles in visible rhythms. Caterpillar, chrysalis, butterfly, death, caterpillar, again and again. The boundaries between stages blurring until all forms exist at once. And the question that haunts every testimony, that lingers in every account: what would it mean to enter fully? Not to visit and return, but to stay, to surrender to the garden's temporal nature, to let your own biology begin cycling? Would it be immortality, existing forever, cycling endlessly through your lifespan without ever reaching the final moment? Or would it be the deepest death, trapped in repetition, so complete that nothing new could ever occur? Consciousness cycling through the same patterns eternally, immortal but unchanging, alive but never truly living. Perhaps the garden offers both and neither. Perhaps immortality and eternal death are the same thing observed from different angles, and the garden simply makes this truth visible by removing the illusion of linear progression that allows us to distinguish living from dying. The chapter closes as consciousness closes each night, not with answers, but with images that linger in the borderlands of sleep. A flower blooming, wilting, blooming, the rhythm eternal, hypnotic, suggesting that all life moves in such cycles, that birth and death are phases of a single process we mistake for journey with beginning and end. The garden waits, if it exists, hidden in a valley that maps cannot hold, protected by passages that shift like breathing, sealed away from linear time, where we conduct our lives under the comforting illusion that today leads to tomorrow, that we move forward through our years, that death waits ahead, rather than beside us, always that birth is behind rather than eternally present. Perhaps the garden is not a place but a truth, the truth that underneath progression's illusion, everything cycles. That the flower in your garden and the flower in that impossible valley differ only in the speed of their turning. That all life blooms and wilts and blooms again, just usually across spans that let us pretend the cycle is a line. Perhaps we are all in the garden already cycling through our existence, and linear time is merely the slow enough rhythm that allows consciousness to pretend it's going somewhere, achieving something, progressing toward destinations, that if the garden reveals anything we have already reached and left, and reached again in patterns so vast we mistake them for straight lines. The pulse continues, life becoming, death arriving, both happening always, eternally, the garden where nothing dies because nothing was ever fully born, where immortality and mortality are the same flower seen from different angles, blooming and wilting in rhythm with everything that has ever lived, that will ever live, that is living now in the eternal present, where the garden grows, patient and terrible and beautiful, waiting for those ready to understand that time's arrow is an illusion and existence has always been a circle closing on itself. A garden where the end and beginning are the same gate, and the only journey is the one that never leaves, never arrives, only cycles endlessly through the same sacred, terrible, eternal becoming. The flower blooms, the flower wilts, the flower blooms, and in that rhythm, if we listen deeply enough as sleep approaches, we might hear the pulse of all existence, not progressing, not ending, only being, forever, in the garden where nothing dies because death and life are merely seasons in a year that never ends, cycles in a rhythm that never concludes, moments in an eternity that contains all times and is, perhaps, the only time that has ever truly existed. The song that existed before music. In the beginning, before the beginning, there was sound. Not silence waiting to be broken, but a vibration so fundamental, so woven into the fabric of existence itself, that silence and sound had not yet separated into distinct states. A frequency at which being itself resonates. A rhythm underlying all thought, all consciousness, all the awareness that would eventually learn to recognize itself as separate from the vast hum of everything. Deep in anthropological records, scattered like seeds through sacred texts of traditions that predate the invention of writing, references appear to something that should not be possible. A song that existed before music. A melody known to all humans once before we forgot, before we fell into the particular and lost our connection to the universal tone. They describe it in language that strains at the boundaries of what words can hold, the frequency at which consciousness vibrates. The rhythm that thought dances to without knowing it's dancing, the harmony from which all music descends like children from a parent they no longer remember. It is said that shamans across unconnected cultures have attempted to recreate it, spending lifetimes in ritual and meditation, pursuing brief moments of recognition where the sound emerges from beneath the noise of ordinary perception. Those who touch it, even for seconds, are changed. They speak of remembering something they never learned, of understanding briefly what it means to exist not as separate self, but as expression of the single consciousness that manifests as multiplicity. The outline begins before beginning, in the silence from which all sound emerges, or rather, in the recognition that what we call silence is merely our deafness to frequencies we have forgotten how to perceive. What does it mean for music to exist as concept before manifestation? For song to precede the first voice that shaped breath into melody, the first hands that struck stone against hollow log and heard rhythm emerge? Ethnomusicologists who have dedicated careers to collecting these accounts report findings that trouble their training. Impossible consistency across cultures that should have had no contact. The same intervals described in Aboriginal Dreamtime songs said to have been sung by ancestors who existed before time became linear appear in Sufi mystical poetry from medieval Persia. Identical rhythmic patterns encoded in African tribal traditions emerge in Celtic Druid chants preserved through oral transmission across millennia. The intervals are not random. They follow mathematical relationships that predate human discovery of mathematics, ratios that appear in spiral galaxies and nautilus shells, in the orbits of planets and the structure of DNA. As if the song is not human invention but cosmic constant, and various cultures merely rediscovered fragments, remembered portions, transcribed what they could capture of something too vast to hold completely. Ancient instruments preserved in museums deepen the mystery. Flutes carved from bone in Paleolithic caves, their finger holes positioned to produce frequencies that human ears cannot quite consciously hear, but that resonate in bone and blood and the fluid that surrounds the brain. Drums from cultures separated by oceans, their dimensions calculated to generate rhythms that bypass auditory processing and synchronize directly with heartbeat, with breath, with the electrical firing of neurons. One such instrument, a bowl carved from single piece of crystal, origin unknown, age disputed, sits in a private collection, played only once in recent history. The player reported that the tones it produced were not heard so much as felt, vibrations that moved through flesh and seemed to reorganize something at the cellular level. For days afterward, she experienced synesthesia, seeing sounds, hearing colors, tasting textures. More disturbing, she reported memories of places she had never been, landscapes that felt older than human history, skies with different constellations. The sense of having existed before birth in forms that were not quite human, but were somehow essentially herself. Whispers tell us that modern researchers, armed with computers and synthesizers, have attempted to recreate the primordial song based on these scattered accounts. They gather the descriptions, analyze the mathematical relationships, generate tones that theoretically match what ancient texts describe. Some listeners report nothing pleasant sounds, interesting experiments, but nothing that penetrates deeper than aesthetic appreciation. Others experience profound shifts. They describe the sound triggering something dormant, awakening capacities they did not know they possessed. Time distortion, where minutes of listening feel like hours or hours compress into moments. Memories surfacing that cannot be personal to other, scenes from lives they have not lived, or perhaps lives that all humans share in some collective substrate of consciousness. Most disturbing are reports of inexplicable grief. Listeners suddenly weeping without understanding why, mourning something they cannot name, feeling overwhelming loss for a state they cannot remember, but that the sound seems to remind them they once possessed. As if the music recalls what we were before we became fragmented into individual selves, and the recognition of that loss is almost unbearable. Neuroscientists studying the phenomenon measure changes in brain activity unlike anything normally observed. The frequencies entrain brainwaves into patterns that should not be sustainable, multiple brain regions synchronizing with precision, usually seen only during deep meditation or certain stages of REM sleep, but occurring in fully conscious subjects. Harmonics trigger activation in brain areas that typically remain dormant, regions whose function is still debated, that some researchers speculate are evolutionary remnants or perhaps evolutionary potentials we have not yet developed. Most intriguing are measurements suggesting the sounds affect processes at quantum scales, the microtubules within neurons, where some theorists propose consciousness itself might emerge from quantum coherence. The rhythms synchronize with these processes, creating states of coherence that persist longer than physics suggests should be possible, as if the music stabilizes quantum effects that normally collapse too quickly for macroscopic influence. Beneath the silence of laboratory measurements, accounts emerge from those who claim to have heard the primordial song fully, not reconstructions or fragments, but the actual sound accessed through meditation or dreams or moments of crisis, when ordinary consciousness dissolved and something older emerged. Most cannot describe what happened. Language fails, they say, because the experience exists before language, in the territory where meaning has not yet separated into discrete concepts that words can capture. But they speak around it, approaching the ineffable through metaphor and suggestion. They describe understanding, briefly, what they were before they were born, not in the sense of past lives or reincarnation, but something more fundamental, recognizing themselves as temporary expressions of consciousness that is neither born or dies but manifests and dissolves in patterns like waves on an ocean. The music, they say, is what the ocean sounds like from the perspective of the wave, the sound of the totality recognizing itself through the experience of the particular. One account, preserved in a monastery archive, describes a monk who spent 40 years seeking the primordial sound through chant and meditation. In his final days, his brothers reported that he suddenly stopped mid-prayer, his face transforming with recognition. He spoke only once more. It was never lost. I was simply listening with the wrong ears. The sound is what I am, what we all are, and it has been playing continuously since before the first stars ignited. We are not hearing it, we are it, hearing itself through the instrument of flesh and time. The mystery deepens when we consider why this knowledge was preserved at all. Why do scattered traditions across continents and millennia maintain references to this sound? Why teach techniques for accessing it if it cannot be captured or transmitted directly? Perhaps because the song serves as reminder evidence encoded in the deepest layers of human cultural memory that we are not what we think we are. That individual consciousness is surface phenomenon, and beneath it runs connection to something vast, something that was never born and cannot die, something that expresses itself through countless forms while remaining fundamentally one. The primordial song might be named for the vibration of consciousness itself, not consciousness as property of individual brains, but consciousness as fundamental feature of reality, the ground from which matter and energy and time emerge. What physics calls quantum fields, what mystics call divine ground, what the song names without words as the tone underlying existence. Where memory fades and sleep approaches, the invitation remains to listen with different ears, to attune to frequencies that play beneath the noise of thought and sensation. The techniques are preserved in traditions worldwide. Meditation that quiets the mind until background hum becomes perceptible. Chanting that synchronizes breath and heartbeat and neural firing until individual rhythm aligns with universal rhythm. Ritual that creates conditions where ordinary consciousness temporarily dissolves and something older emerges. Some practitioners report hearing it first as ringing in the ears, a tone that seems to come from inside the skull rather than from any external source. Others describe it as silence that somehow contains all sounds, emptiness that is paradoxically full. Still others speak of it not as auditory phenomenon at all, but as recognition, suddenly understanding that the sense of being separate self is learned behavior, that beneath the learned separation runs continuous connection to the vast consciousness that wears all forms while remaining formless. Perhaps the primordial song cannot be heard because we are at the instrument through which universal consciousness plays itself, the temporary form through which the formless experiences texture and time. Asking to hear the fundamental sound is like asking your eye to see itself directly. You are too close, too implicated in the phenomenon, to perceive it as object separate from subject. But sometimes, in states where subject-object distinction dissolves, in moments when the boundaries we maintain through constant effort temporarily relax, in deep meditation, in dreams, in the borderland between waking and sleep where you drift now, the song emerges, not as something heard, but as something remembered, not as external sound, but as recognition of what you are beneath the learned identity, beneath the temporary form, beneath all the specificity that makes you feel separate from the whole. The chapter closes not with conclusion, but with invitation, with the suggestion that this sound still exists, has always existed, will always exist, that consciousness itself is the instrument playing it, that every thought that moves through your mind, every sensation that registers in your awareness, every moment of being alive and conscious, is the primordial song expressing itself through the particular configuration that you temporarily are, that we are always hearing it, beneath the noise of living, beneath the thoughts that claim attention, beneath the fears and desires that seem so urgent. It plays continuously, this fundamental frequency, this rhythm underlying all thought, this harmony from which all music, all structure, all pattern, all meaning descends. And learning to hear it again, not matter of acquiring new knowledge, but of removing the learned deafness, of letting go the beliefs that tell us we are separate, of allowing consciousness to recognize itself in the mirror of existence, to hear in the multiplicity of sounds the single tone that gives rise to all music, all meaning, All the awareness that asks questions and seeks answers and wonders, as you wonder now, what lies beneath the surface of experience. Listen, not with ears, with the awareness behind ears, with the consciousness that interprets vibrations as sound and meaning. Listen to the silence between heartbeats, the gap between thoughts, the space where nothing seems to be, but everything is. The song plays there, has always played there, will always play there. And you, listening now as sleep approaches, as consciousness begins its nightly journey into territories where subject and object dissolve, you are not listening to it. You are it. Listening to itself, the primordial song recognizing its own music through the temporary instrument of your awareness, playing the ancient melody that existed before the first star sang its nuclear fusion into the void that will exist after the last light fades. Eternal and fundamental as the consciousness that manifests as everything, hears itself as music, and recognizes in that hearing what it has always been. The song, the singer, the silence from which both emerge. The listener who is the listened to. The sound of being sound. Sounding itself into existence moment by eternal moment. Forever is space where you rest, where music and silence are the same breath, the same vibration, the same fundamental frequency at which everything that is. Listen, the song continues, it has never stopped, and you have never stopped hearing it, even when you forgot you were listening, even when you believed yourself separate from the sound. The music plays, the silence holds it, and consciousness, your consciousness, all consciousness, the single consciousness wearing infinite forms recognizes itself in the eternal song. The melody before melody. The rhythm before rhythm. The sound that existed before music and will exist after. Because it is not sound but the capacity for sound. Not music, but the awareness within which music becomes possible. Not beginning or ending, but the eternal now where all songs play simultaneously, and silence is merely another name for the fullness that contains everything, knows everything, is everything, including you, listening, as sleep arrives, as consciousness shifts into the frequency where the primordial song plays most clearly, where the ancient rhythm carries you into dreams that remember what waking forgets, that you have always been the music. And the music has always been playing, and the playing is what it means to be. The text written in vanishing ink. There is a particular kind of emptiness that exists on a blank page, not the emptiness of nothing, but the emptiness of everything not yet spoken, all possible meanings waiting in the white space, like seeds beneath snow. But what if the emptiness is not waiting but returning? What if the page was once full, and the fullness consumed itself in the act of being understood, leaving only the ghost of meaning impressed into consciousness, and the blank surface as evidence that transmission occurred? In the vaults of collectors whose names are whispered rather than spoken, in the secured rooms of ancient libraries where air is controlled, and light is rationed, there exist books written in scripts that fade as they are read, words that disappear the moment they are understood, knowledge that consumes itself in the act of transmission, leaving nothing behind but transformation in the reader and emptiness on the page. Medieval scholars spoke of wisdom that protects itself, texts that could be read only once before becoming blank pages, forcing readers not to possess knowledge, but to embody it, to become it, to carry it forward not as information stored externally, but as understanding integrated so completely that the external record became unnecessary. It is said that in a monastery carved into Himalayan cliffs, where wind speaks languages older than human speech, monks discovered a manuscript hidden within walls that had stood for 7 centuries. The pages were filled with text and entire philosophy of enlightenment, techniques for transcending suffering, instructions for navigating consciousness toward liberation. The ink appeared ordinary at first, black against parchment, clear and legible, the characters precise. But as the first monk began reading, he noticed something impossible. The words behind his current line of focus were fading, not slowly, not gradually, but dissolving in real time, as if his comprehension burned them away like frost under morning sun. He read faster, trying to capture as much as possible before it vanished. But the faster he read, the faster the text disappeared, maintaining always the same distance ahead of his understanding. Within an hour, he had traversed the entire manuscript. Behind him, only blank pages remained. The other monks did not believe him. They took the book, found it empty, accused him of fabrication or madness. But in the weeks that followed, his transformation could not be denied. He spoke with clarity about concepts the monastery had debated for generations, resolved paradoxes that had troubled their lineage for centuries, demonstrated understanding that should have required decades of study, and more strangely, his understanding continued to deepen. Months later, he would suddenly grasp implications that had not been clear during his initial reading, as if the text had impressed itself into his consciousness in layers, revealing meanings progressively as he became capable of receiving them. The book had been read once, but its reading continued indefinitely within the architecture of his awareness. The manuscript still exists, preserved in conditions meant to prevent any accidental exposure. It remains blank, but the monastery's records contain testimonies from 7 other monks across 3 centuries who were permitted to read it, each reporting the same phenomenon: text that vanished during comprehension, understanding that deepened for years afterward, meanings that continued emerging long after the pages went white. Scientists who have analyzed the ink samples taken from similar texts discovered elsewhere report findings that challenge the boundary between matter and consciousness. The compounds are complex, incorporating minerals that exist in quantum superposition, maintaining multiple states until observed. But the trigger for their sublimation is not simple observation, it is comprehension itself. The inks respond to specific wavelengths of light, including those produced by human neurological activity during moments of understanding. The electromagnetic signature of consciousness, grasping meaning, literally destroys the text that conveys it. The act of reading becomes an act of consuming, of incorporating, of making external knowledge internal, and thereby erasing the external record. Whispers tell us that alchemical formulas were written in such inks, ensuring secrets could not be stolen, but only earned. A thief who broke into a laboratory and seized texts would find them blank before he reached safety. But an apprentice who studied under proper guidance, who prepared consciousness through meditation and purification, who approached the formulas with reverence rather than greed, such a student would find the text readable, would absorb the knowledge, and would watch the pages empty themselves as understanding filled him. The formulas protected themselves, not through locks or guards, but through the requirement that comprehension precede revelation. You could not possess the knowledge without becoming someone capable of properly using it, and the process of becoming such a person was itself the primary teaching, of which the formula was merely confirmation. Prophecies, too, were sometimes recorded in vanishing ink. Oracles who foresaw disasters would write warnings, seal them, entrust them to temples or kings. When the predictions began manifesting, when those who held the texts finally believed enough to open and read them, the words would fade even as they were understood, leaving no proof after the fact that prophecy had occurred. No evidence that could be used to claim divine authority or manipulate future believers. The knowledge served its purpose: warning received, action taken, disaster averted or prepared for, and then erased itself, refusing to become relic, refusing to accumulate the distortions that come when living wisdom calcifies into dead certainty. Maps to sacred sites vanished once the destination was reached, ensuring pilgrimage could never become tourism, that the journey could never be reduced to following instructions, that each seeker had to engage the search with full presence rather than the partial attention of someone following directions, known to lead somewhere specific. You could reach the sacred site only by becoming someone capable of finding it, and the process of becoming was the pilgrimage, of which the arrival was merely confirmation. Once reached, the map dissolved, leaving the pilgrim unable to guide others, except by encouraging them to undertake their own search, to develop their own capacity for recognition, to follow their own path toward what could not be reached by following. Beneath the silence of historical accounts, modern testimonies emerge. Collectors report purchasing books from obscure dealers, texts bound in leather that resists aging, pages filled with knowledge that seems precisely calibrated to their current questions, their present struggles. They read with fascination, with gratitude, with the sense of finding exactly what they needed, exactly when they needed it. But over days or weeks, they noticed the text fading. Slowly at first, certain passages growing lighter, then entire pages bleaching back toward blankness. They photograph the pages, trying to preserve what's disappearing, but the photographs show only blank paper, as if the text exists in a dimension cameras cannot capture. Eventually, the book is empty, but the reader is changed. Ideas that seemed revolutionary when first encountered have become integrated so completely, they feel obvious, natural, fundamental. Understanding that required the text support initially now stands independently, needing no external reference. The knowledge has been transferred, and the text, having served its purpose, has departed. Some collectors speak of these books with reverence, grateful for teachings that refused to be clung to, that insisted on being lived rather than stored. Others speak with frustration, wanting to share what they read, to prove what they experienced, to build on foundations they can no longer point to. But both groups acknowledge transformation. Something changed. Something was transmitted. Something essential occurred in the exchange between fading text and deepening understanding. The philosophy embedded in this practice becomes clear when considered deeply. Knowledge meant to transform rather than inform, wisdom that must be lived rather than stored, understanding that dies if not continuously reborn in lived experience. Information can be preserved in databases, in books that never fade, in digital formats that maintain perfect fidelity across centuries. But wisdom is different. Wisdom requires not just knowing, but being, just comprehension, but integration, just reading, but transformation. Text written in Vanishing ink acknowledges this distinction. It offers itself not as resource to be hoarded, but as catalyst to be consumed. It does not seek to persist externally, but to be internalized so completely that external persistence becomes unnecessary. It trusts that if the understanding is genuine, it will be expressed through lived life, through choices made, through presence brought to each moment, and such expression is the only meaningful preservation, the only form of transmission that honors what wisdom actually is. Perhaps all true teaching operates this way, and the Vanishing ink merely makes visible what is always happening. The best teachers do not give students information to memorize, but provoke transformations that continue developing long after the lesson ends. The most profound books are not those we reference repeatedly, but those we absorb so completely, we stop needing them, that change how we see and think, and are that make us different people who then live differently because of what was transmitted. The text vanishes because it has been embodied. The external record dissolves because internal transformation has occurred. The page goes blank because consciousness has been inscribed, and consciousness, living, dynamic, continuously regenerating, is the only proper medium for preserving what matters most. Where memory fades and sleep approaches, an image persists, a page in the process of fading, words still partially visible, meaning hovering between presence and absence. You can almost read it. The text is there, but growing fainter, letters losing their definition, sentences becoming suggestions rather than declarations. And in the fading, you sense something, not the loss of information, but the transfer of understanding, not the death of knowledge, but its transformation from external symbol to internal knowing. Perhaps this is how all truth exists, written in Vanishing ink, offered freely, but refusing to be possessed, insisting on being integrated rather than archived, demanding that we become what we seek to know rather than simply knowing about it. Perhaps every moment of genuine understanding consumes the external teaching that provoked it, leaving consciousness transformed and the source silent, having served its purpose. Perhaps teachers fade from memory not because they were unimportant, but because their importance was so complete it became indistinguishable from your own seeing, your own knowing, your own way of being. Perhaps the blank page is not empty, but full of all the understanding that was once written there, and is now written in you. In the choices you make, in the presence you bring, in the life you live that expresses what words can only point toward. The chapter closes with recognition that you are the text now, that consciousness is the page, that every moment of awareness is both writing and reading, both inscription and comprehension, both the vanishing ink and the understanding that remains when the ink is gone. The words fade, The page empties, and what remains is not loss but transformation, not absence, but presence of a different order, the kind that needs no external confirmation, because it is, itself, the confirmation, the living proof, the embodied wisdom that continues teaching through being rather than through being read. Perhaps all truth is written in vanishing ink, offered to consciousness on condition that it be absorbed rather than possessed, lived rather than studied, expressed through presence rather than preserved through reference. And perhaps you have been reading such texts your entire life, moments that taught you and then vanished, experiences that changed you and then dissolved, encounters that opened understanding and then departed, leaving you transformed but unable to point to proof, unable to show the text, unable to reference the teaching except by being who you have become because of it. The page waits, blank, patient, ready to receive the next inscription, the next teaching that will fade, the next truth that will consume itself in transmission, leaving only transformation, only understanding, only the consciousness that has been rewritten by what it read, and now carries forward not as memory, but as way of being. The ink vanishes, the wisdom remains, and you, reading these words as sleep approaches, as consciousness prepares for its nightly transformation, as awareness softens toward the space where all texts dissolve and only understanding persists, you are the book now, the living text, the vanishing ink made visible as life lived, as presence brought, as consciousness aware of itself, reading itself, transforming itself word by word, moment by moment, breath by breath into forms that cannot be preserved, but only expressed, cannot be stored, but only lived, cannot be held, but only released into the continuous becoming that is what you are, what you have always been, what you will always be. The text, the reading, the understanding, the blank page waiting, the vanishing ink, the eternal present where wisdom writes itself, reads itself, erases itself, and begins again, forever now in the space where you rest, where all knowledge returns to its source, where consciousness meets itself in the mirror of awareness and recognizes that it has always been both the text and the reader, the ink and the understanding, the page that empties and the awareness that fills, the teaching that vanishes and the transformation that remains. The words fade to silence, the page returns to white, and understanding, wordless, perfect, complete, continues its patient work of making consciousness more conscious, more present, more alive to what has always been written in the only ink that matters, the vanishing kind that insists on being lived rather than merely known, that dissolves in transmission but leaves transformation in its wake, that empties the external so the internal can fill, that sacrifices preservation for the sake of presence, that chooses lived wisdom over stored information, and that, in the end, is the only kind of truth that truly transforms, truly teaches, truly matters. Sleep comes, the page is blank, and you carry within you all the texts that ever faded, all the wisdom that ever vanished, all the understanding that consumed its source and became indistinguishable from your seeing, your knowing, your being. The ink has vanished, the truth remains, and you are at reading yourself, writing yourself, fading and reforming endlessly in the great book that has no pages because it is all pages, no words because it is all words, no beginning or ending because it is always already everything, expressed through the temporary inscription called your life, your consciousness, your presence, the text that writes itself by reading itself, the vanishing ink that never truly vanishes, because it has become the awareness that recognizes finally that there was never anything to preserve, because everything worth knowing must be continuously lived, continuously expressed, continuously offered and released, and discovered again in the eternal present where all wisdom dwells. The page is blank, the teaching complete, and sleep arrives like an empty page, waiting for tomorrow's inscription, tomorrow's reading, tomorrow's vanishing into understanding that persists beyond words, beyond symbols, beyond everything except the consciousness that carries it forward into whatever comes next. The threshold that no one has crossed twice. There is a line drawn across certain landscapes that has no substance, yet cannot be uncrossed, not marked by stone or steel, not visible to eyes that seek boundaries in the conventional sense, but present nonetheless a transition between here and somewhere else. A membrane so thin it offers no resistance to passage, yet absolute enough that those who cross never return. At the edges of maps, both ancient and modern, in places where cartography falters and coordinates become suggestions rather than certainties, travelers report encountering these thresholds. They describe the moment of recognition, standing on familiar ground while sensing that another step forward will carry them somewhere fundamentally other, that crossing this invisible line will change not just location, but the laws that govern existence itself. Some cross deliberately, others stumble through unknowing, but the consistency is absolute and unsettling. No one reports crossing back. Yet testimonies continue to emerge. Letters written in familiar hands, describing worlds that should not be. Journals that appear in places the writers never reached, containing accounts of what lies beyond. Messages sent through means mundane and mysterious, finding their way back across boundaries that refuse reverse passage, as if the threshold allows communication but not return, permits witness but forbids retreat. It is said that the moment before crossing is marked by a particular quality of awareness, sudden clarity that makes the ordinary world seem dreamlike by contrast. A sharpening of perception that comes with recognition that you stand at the edge of something momentous, that the next step will be irrevocable, that you are about to trade the known for the unknowable, and there will be no journey home. Those who have stood at these thresholds and chosen not to cross describe the sensation, gravity seeming to shift, pulling forward with insistence that has nothing to do with the body's weight. Air that tastes different, carries fragrances that don't quite match any flower or earth or rain that exists in the consensus world. Light that falls at wrong angles, casting shadows that point directions shadows should not point. And always, the knowledge certain and inexplicable that crossing means not returning, that whatever waits beyond is not another location in the geography we share, but another configuration of reality itself, where the rules that make return possible simply don't apply. Historical accounts preserve testimonies from those who chose to cross and somehow managed to send final messages back. An explorer in the 18th century, traveling regions of Tibet that maps showed as blank, wrote of finding a valley where the air shimmered as if reality itself was uncertain. His journal describes approaching what he called the line of no return, visible but palpable, a boundary he could feel pressing against his chest as he drew near. His final entry, discovered years later in a monastery he never visited, describes his decision to cross. I have spent my life seeking what lies beyond the known world. Now, I stand at the ultimate boundary, and I find I cannot turn back, not because return is physically prevented, but because I have glimpsed enough to understand that remaining would mean living forever with the question. Better to have answer without return than question without resolution. I will cross at dawn. If this journal reaches civilization, know that I went willingly into the somewhere else, and that my only regret is being unable to describe what I found, for the words I have are shaped by this world, and will not hold the contours of another. The journal ends there. How it reached the monastery, how it crossed back when he could not, remains unexplained. Whispers tell us that mystics across traditions have spoken of these thresholds, describing them as boundaries between parallel worlds where physics bends to different laws. The Tibetans called them doorways to the Bardo realms, states of existence that interpenetrate our own but operate according to alternative principles. Sufis spoke of the stations beyond station, places where the soul could travel, but from which the body could not return. Celtic traditions referenced thin places, where the veil between worlds grew permeable, where one could pass through, but passage was one-way transformation so complete that the person who arrived on the far side was no longer the person who crossed. Modern science has attempted to investigate these reports with instruments designed to detect anomalies, to measure what should not vary. Researchers have traveled to locations where thresholds are reportedly most stable: valleys in Nepal, certain coordinates in the Pacific, regions of the Sahara where caravans have vanished without explanation. Their equipment detects disturbances, magnetic fields that fluctuate wildly, gravitational measurements that refuse to stabilize, spectroscopic analysis showing light frequencies that don't match any known source. But satellites show nothing. Aerial photography reveals only ordinary landscape. The anomalies exist at ground level, human scale, as if these thresholds respond to consciousness rather than coordinates, appear to awareness, but hide from remote observation. Expeditions have tried to map the zone systematically. They establish perimeters, document changes in instrument readings, attempt to define the boundaries with precision. But the thresholds seem to move, or perhaps they exist in a dimension perpendicular to the three we navigate, easily appearing and disappearing based on factors the researchers cannot isolate: lunar phases, solar activity, electromagnetic conditions, or simply the intention of those who approach. Ground reports continue accumulating. Hikers who vanish from marked trails, last seen walking toward areas their companions describe as wrong, where perspective didn't quite work, where distances seem to compress or expand unpredictably. Aircraft that deviate around spaces their instruments register as empty. Pilots reporting feeling compelled to alter course, sensing danger not in equipment warnings, but in a more primal recognition that they were approaching something their vehicles should not penetrate. Ships radio back descriptions of horizons that curve the wrong way, of stars visible in daylight, of water that flows uphill. Then communications cease. Not dramatically, not with distress calls, but simply last message sent, no response to calls. Vessel never arrives at destination, no wreckage found, as if the ship crossed into a version of ocean that exists alongside ours, but cannot be reached from here, only from there. After crossing thresholds that permit only one direction of travel, beneath the silence of official investigations, theories proliferate. Dimensional boundaries made permeable by forces we don't understand, natural or artificial, ancient or eternal regions, where the membrane separating parallel universes grows thin enough that consciousness can perceive both sides, and crossing becomes possible for those willing to abandon this version of reality for another. Places where the multiverse brushes against itself, where infinite variations of existence run parallel and occasionally tangent lines touch, creating temporary or permanent portals between configurations of physical law, each viable, each capable of sustaining consciousness, but incompatible in ways that make return impossible once transition occurs. Thresholds that open based on consciousness rather than coordinates, responding not to where you stand, but to what you are, what you carry in awareness, what readiness or desperation or openness makes you perceive, what others walk past unknowing. Portals that are always there, but visible only to those at specific stages of understanding, specific states of being, specific points in their journey through existence. Where memory fades and sleep approaches, the testimonies that do return grow stranger. Not journals discovered in normal ways, but accounts found in impossible locations, manuscripts appearing in locked archives, written in languages the authors never learned, containing details they could not have known. Letters washing ashore in bottles, describing worlds where time moves in spirals rather than lines, where cause and effect operate loosely if at all, where consciousness shapes matter more directly and thought manifests as physical change. Some write of skies the color of water, not blue like our sky, but actually aqueous, with the thickness and movement of ocean overhead, somehow not falling, with stars visible through the translucent depths above. They describe gravity that pulls sideways, cities built on vertical surfaces as easily as horizontal ones, people who walk on walls without considering it unusual, because in their world, down is a preference rather than an absolute. Others speak of time experienced non-linearly, past and future accessible, the way we access different rooms in a house, movement through chronology, as easy as movement through space. They describe watching their own births and deaths as present events, conversing with their past selves, learning from their future selves, all versions existing simultaneously in eternal present that somehow accommodates sequence without being constrained by it. Most striking are accounts suggesting that consciousness operates differently in these other places. That thought shapes reality more directly, that the observer effect scales from quantum to macroscopic, that attention and intention carry weight that manifests physically. They write of learning to create through focused awareness, to alter their environment through meditation, to communicate directly mind to mind, because in worlds where thought affects matter, the boundary between minds grows permeable, and they write of not wishing to return. Not because return is impossible, though it seems to be, but because the transformation is complete. Because who they became on the other side has adapted to laws we don't share, developed capacities we don't possess, integrated with the reality that makes our world seem limited by comparison. Return would mean surrendering those capacities, relearning limitations, accepting constraints that now feel arbitrary. One message, found in a desert cave where no one could have traveled, ends, I cannot explain why return is not possible, except to say that the person who crossed is not the person writing this. I have become something this world cannot contain, or I am now native to a world I cannot leave. Perhaps it is the same thing. Tell those I love that I am not lost but found, not trapped but freed, not dead but more alive than when I breathed your air. And tell those who stand where I once stood, deciding whether to cross, choose based not on what you hope to find, but on what you are willing to release. The crossing demands everything. What it offers in return cannot be carried back, only lived forward in a place where forward means something different than it does on the side you call home. The chapter closes where it began, at the threshold, still crossable, still one way, still holding the promise or threat of transformation so complete that return becomes not impossible but irrelevant. These boundaries exist, scattered across the world, visible to those who reach them through intention or accident, or the mysterious guidance that leads seekers to what they need. They wait with the patience of stone and the indifference of laws that govern without judging. Perhaps you will encounter one. Perhaps you already have and chose, consciously or not, to step back. Perhaps every major transition in life is a smaller version of these absolute thresholds, moments when crossing means becoming someone who cannot return to who you were, when transformation is so complete that the past becomes foreign country and you, changed, are no longer citizen there. The threshold waits, neither inviting nor warning, simply existing as all boundaries exist, marking where one way of being ends and another begins. And on both sides, consciousness continues here in the world we know, there in worlds we can only hear about through messages that somehow cross back even when their senders cannot, testimonies written by those who chose the irreversible step, who traded return for revelation, who stand now in realities we cannot reach except by joining them, by making the same choice, by crossing the same threshold that has never permitted anyone to cross twice, because the first crossing changes you so completely that the you who might return no longer exists. The line remains drawn, invisible, absolute, patient, waiting for the next traveler who will stand at the edge of everything they know, feeling the pull of everything they don't, and make the choice that cannot be unmade, to stay or to cross, to remain here or to become there, to live with the question or to answer it at the cost of every certainty except the one that matters most, that somewhere, beyond the boundaries we maintain through habit and fear and the comfort of the familiar, other ways of being wait, other configurations of existence, other versions of consciousness, matter, time, reality itself, and that some truths can only be known by those willing to cross thresholds from which there is no return, to become what we cannot imagine while remaining what we are, to surrender the world we know for worlds we can only barely glimpse until we step across the line that divides here from the now from then, this from that, us from who we might become if we dare to cross, once, forever, into the somewhere else that waits beyond all maps, beyond all return, beyond everything except the eternal present of transformation that continues always in places we cannot reach except by becoming unreachable ourselves. The threshold waits, the choice remains, and the silence holds both invitation and warning, both promise and threat, both everything and nothing depending on which side you stand, and whether you dare to step across.